The morning sun cut through the Georgia pines like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. The kind of light that made everything on Fort Benning look older than it was. Command Sergeant Major James Mackenzie stood at the edge of the outdoor range, hands clasped behind his back, watching a kid who couldn't have been more than 22 line up a shot he had no business taking. The rifle wavered. The breathing was wrong. The grip showed every ounce of tension the young soldier was trying to hide. James said nothing, just watched, waited. The way he'd learned to wait 40 years ago in deserts so vast you could see the enemy coming for miles and still not be ready when they arrived. The shot cracked across the range. Dirt kicked up 3 feet left of the target. The kid swore, loud enough for the whole line to hear. A few of the other soldiers snickered. James walked forward, boots crunching on gravel, each step measured like he had all the time in the world. Because he did. At 68 years old, time was the only thing he had in abundance, and even that was borrowed. He stopped behind the shooter, close enough that the kid stiffened. "What did you do wrong?" James asked. His voice was quiet, rough from decades of cigarettes he'd quit 20 years ago and a throat that had screamed orders in sandstorms until it bled. The soldier turned, saw the rank on James's chest, and his face went white. The wind, sir, I didn't compensate enough for the crosswind." "The wind?" James nodded slowly like he was considering this. "Son, the wind didn't make you miss. Your ego did." Silence across the firing line now. Everyone was listening. "You took a shot you weren't ready for because you wanted to impress the men next to you. That's not marksmanship. That's pride. And pride gets people killed." James held out his hand. "Give me the rifle." The kid handed it over like he was surrendering a nuclear code. James felt the weight of it, the M4 carbine with its polymer furniture and red dot sight. So different from the weapons of his youth, but still fundamentally the same. A tool for ending lives. Nothing more, nothing less. He settled into position, movements economical, practiced. The muscle memory of a man who'd done this so many times it had worn grooves into his soul. His knees protested. His shoulder ached where shrapnel had torn through it in 1991 and never quite healed right. But his hands were steady. "You don't master the rifle," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You respect it. You breathe with it. You become part of it. And when you do that, the rifle will take care of you." He fired 3 times. 3 holes appeared in the center mass of the target, 500 yards downrange, grouped so tight you could cover them with a playing card. James stood, handed the rifle back to the stunned soldier, and walked away without another word. Behind him, he heard one of the instructors bark at the line to get back to work, but he also heard something else. Whispers. The kind that followed men like him everywhere they went. Words like legend and ghost, and stories about things that may or may not have happened in places the Army would never acknowledge existed. He was almost to the admin building when he heard footsteps behind him, quick and purposeful. "Sir, Sergeant Major Mackenzie." James turned. The man approaching was maybe 30, lean and hard the way only special operations soldiers got, with the kind of tan that came from months in desert sun and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. He wore civilian clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, but the way he carried himself screamed military. "I'm not active duty anymore, son," James said. "You don't need to sir me. My name is Dylan Cross." The man stopped 3 feet away, hand extended. "Captain Dylan Cross, SEAL Team 3. The name hit James like a fist to the chest. Cross. Robert Cross had been a staff sergeant in the Marines, a machine gunner with arms like tree trunks and a laugh that could carry across a firebase. Bobby had saved James's life during the Battle of Kuwait International Airport in 1991, had thrown himself between James and an Iraqi RPG team, taking rounds meant for the sniper who was supposed to be covering him. Those rounds had torn Bobby apart, left him bleeding out on sand that turned dark with Marine blood. James had held Bobby's hand in the medevac helicopter while the medic worked frantically, had watched the light go out of his friend's eyes somewhere over the Persian Gulf, had heard Bobby's last words. "Take care of Jenny and the baby, Jim. Promise me." He'd promised, and for 23 years he'd kept that promise in the only way he knew how. Anonymous money orders to help with bills. Scholarship funds that appeared out of nowhere for the boys' college. Thanksgiving dinners at a house in North Carolina where a widow and her son welcomed him every year without ever knowing why he really came. Now that boy stood in front of him, grown into a man, wearing the same expression his father had worn. Determination layered over fear. Courage built on a foundation of knowing exactly how bad things could get. James took the offered hand. Dylan's grip was firm, confident, but there was something else there too, a tremor, emotion barely contained. "Your father," James said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Bobby, he was the best man I ever served with." Dylan nodded, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The Georgia heat pressed down on them, cicadas screaming in the pines. And somewhere in the distance, a drill sergeant was tearing into a platoon about the importance of maintaining their weapons. "He wrote about you," Dylan said finally, "in his letters home. Said you were the best shot he'd ever seen. Said you could thread a bullet through the eye of a needle at 1,000 yards. Your father was a liar." James smiled just a little. "I miss plenty. The difference is I learned from it." Dylan pulled something from his pocket, a small brass compass, tarnished and worn, with initials scratched into the back. "RC to JM. Come home." "Mom gave this to me before she died," Dylan said. "Said Dad gave it to you after some operation went bad. Said it was supposed to bring you home safe." James stared at the compass. He'd carried it through 2 more years of operations in the Middle East, through classified missions in Syria and Yemen that officially never happened, through firefights, in ambushes, and long nights in the desert where the darkness felt like it would swallow him whole. He'd mailed it back to Jenny after he'd finally come home in 1993, unable to look at it anymore without seeing Bobby's face. "Why are you here, Captain?" James asked quietly. "I'm deploying to Afghanistan in 2 weeks. SEAL Team 3, Eastern Provinces. Advisory mission." Dylan held out the compass. "I wanted to meet the man my father died for, and I wanted to give this back to you. It brought you home once. Maybe it'll do the same for me." James took the compass, felt the weight of it, the history, the blood price that had been paid for the simple act of trying to survive. He closed his fist around it. "You keep it," he said, pressing it back into Dylan's hand. "Your father gave it to me. Now I'm giving it to you. Come back safe, son. That's an order." Dylan's eyes glistened just for a second, and then he was all business again, all operator, emotion locked away behind training and discipline. He nodded once, sharp and precise, then turned and walked away. James watched him go and felt something shift in his chest, a premonition, a sense that this wasn't the last time he'd see Robert cross his son. The universe had a way of bringing things full circle, of balancing debts in blood and bone. He just didn't know yet how steep the price would be. 3 days later, James was sitting on his porch in Montana, watching the sun set over the mountains, when his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered it anyway. Old habits from a lifetime of classified work. Mackenzie. His voice was flat, professional, the way it always got when the past came calling. "Jim, it's Tom Riggs." General Thomas Riggs had been a lieutenant in 1991 when James had pulled him out of a burning Humvee in the Kuwaiti desert, Tom's legs shredded by shrapnel, screaming for his mother while James dragged him to safety. Now he was a 2-star general at CENTCOM, one of the few men in the military who knew exactly what James had done during the Gulf War and exactly what he'd done in the years after, when the war was officially over, but the killing continued in the shadows. "I'm retired, Tom," James said. "Whatever you need, I'm not your man. 2 weeks, that's all I'm asking." Riggs's voice had that tone, the one that meant he wasn't really asking at all. "Consultant work. We've got new training protocols going into effect in Afghanistan, long-range precision marksman stuff. I need someone with experience to observe. Make sure the kids aren't getting themselves killed with bad tactics. Send someone from Benning. They've got a dozen instructors who can do that. I need someone who's been there, Jim. Someone who knows what it's really like when the bullets start flying and the training manuals don't mean a damn thing." A pause. "I need someone I trust." James watched the sunset, the sky bleeding red and orange across the peaks, and thought about what trust really meant. It meant favors owed and debts called in. It meant young men dying in places their families couldn't pronounce because old men made decisions in air-conditioned offices. It meant doing things you couldn't talk about and living with ghosts that never quite left you alone. 2 weeks, James said, and then I'm done, permanently. 2 weeks, I'll have the orders cut by morning. The line went dead. James set the phone down and looked at his hands. They were spotted with age, scarred from a lifetime of rough work, but they were steady, still steady, even now. His wife Mary came out onto the porch, 2 glasses of iced tea in her hands. She'd been with him for 40 years, through the nightmares and the silences, and the times when he'd wake up at 3 in the morning and sit in the dark until dawn, unable to close his eyes without seeing faces he'd killed or faces he'd failed to save. That was Tom, she said. It wasn't a question. They want me to go to Afghanistan, just for a couple weeks. Observer role. Mary handed him a glass and sat down in the chair next to his. She didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there in the fading light. And James loved her more in that moment than he ever had before, because she understood what it meant. She'd always understood. You've been restless, she said finally. Maybe this will help. Maybe it'll give you some closure. I don't think there's any closure in war, sweetheart. Just different kinds of ghosts. Then maybe it's time you made peace with yours. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat there together while the light died and the stars came out, bright and cold and indifferent to the struggles of men who fought and died in the dirt below them. The flight to Afghanistan was long and uncomfortable. 20 hours of cramped seats and bad food and the constant drone of engines that never quite let you forget you were trapped in a metal tube 7 miles above the earth. James slept in fits and starts, dreams fragmenting into memories that felt more real than the present. He was 25 again, crouched behind a burned-out Iraqi tank with Bobby Cross beside him, watching a ridgeline for movement that never came until it was too late. He was 26, holding his rifle steady, while a Soviet advisor coordinated defensive positions for retreating Iraqi forces, crosshairs settling on a man's chest, finger taking up slack on the trigger. He was 27, standing in a cemetery in North Carolina, rain soaking through his dress uniform, watching a flag get folded and handed to a widow who didn't know that her husband's death was James's fault. Would always be James's fault, because he'd been the one to call for the assault and Bobby had been the one to cover the advance. He woke up somewhere over the Atlantic with his heart hammering and his hands clenched so tight his nails had drawn blood from his palms. The man in the seat next to him, a young Marine who couldn't have been more than 20, was staring. "You all right, sir?" the Marine asked. James nodded, not trusting his voice yet. He took a slow breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the VA therapist had taught him decades ago. It didn't help much, but it was something. "First deployment?" James asked when he could speak again. "Yes, sir. Infantry, Camp Leatherneck." "You scared?" The kid hesitated, then nodded. Honesty was rare enough to be worth respecting. "Good," James said. "Fear keeps you alert. It's when you stop being scared that you get stupid. Remember that." The Marine nodded like James had just handed him the keys to the universe, and maybe in a small way he had. The difference between coming home and not coming home was usually measured in tiny moments of judgment, split-second decisions between doing what felt brave and doing what kept you alive. Forward Operating Base Salerno sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that looked like the earth had tried to claw its way into the sky and gotten stuck halfway. The base was all HESCO barriers and blast walls, guard towers and concertina wire, a little fortress of American military power carved out of land that had been killing invaders for thousands of years. James stepped off the transport plane and immediately felt the heat slam into him like a physical thing. It was different from the Gulf's humid, oppressive heat. This was dry and sharp, the kind that sucked the moisture right out of your lungs and left you feeling like you were breathing fire. A staff sergeant met him at the terminal, clipboard in hand, looking hassled. "Sergeant Major Mackenzie, I'm supposed to escort you to the briefing room. SEAL team is waiting." James followed him through the maze of containerized housing units in tactical operations centers, past soldiers who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. He was too old to be active duty, too squared away to be a contractor, and the lack of any visible rank or unit insignia made him an anomaly. In a combat zone, anomalies attracted attention. The briefing room was a plywood box with a projector, a map of the region, and 8 men who looked like they could kill you with a spoon and not lose any sleep over it. Navy SEALs, the modern evolution of warriors James had fought alongside a lifetime ago, men trained to an edge so sharp they could cut through anything. One of them stood as James entered, Dylan Cross. The shock of recognition must have shown on James's face because Dylan smiled, just a little, and there was Bobby in that smile, Bobby's humor and Bobby's warmth. "Small world, sir," Dylan said and offered his hand again. James took it, shook it, felt the same tremor of emotion from their first meeting. "Your advisory mission." "My advisory mission, this is my team." Dylan gestured to the others. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hayes, second in command, Petty Officer Jake Morrison, our sniper, Doc Ramirez, corpsman, the rest of the crew." They nodded as they were introduced, faces ranging from curious to skeptical. Morrison, the sniper, looked James up and down with the particular disdain young experts reserve for old has-beens who thought they still had something to teach. "Heard you were good back in the day," Morrison said. It wasn't quite a challenge, but it wasn't quite respect either. Different game now, though. Technology's changed everything. "Bullets still fly the same direction," James said mildly. "Physics hasn't changed much in 40 years. Morrison's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a major entered the room, and everyone snapped to attention. The briefing was standard operations procedure, details about a convoy escort through the Shadowy Pass, a notorious stretch of road where the mountains created perfect ambush conditions and the enemy knew every rock and shadow. "Intel says the area's been quiet for 2 weeks, the major said, pointing to the map. "But we've lost 2 convoys there in the last 3 months. Sniper fire, IEDs, coordinated ambushes. Whoever's operating in that area knows what they're doing." James studied the map, the contour lines showing elevation changes, the narrow pass with high ground on both sides. It looked exactly like a dozen places in Iraq and Kuwait where he'd seen good men die, where the terrain itself seemed to conspire with the enemy to create kill zones you couldn't escape. "Sir," he said, interrupting the briefing, "this is a bad idea." The room went quiet. The major turned to look at him, face carefully neutral. "Explain, Sergeant Major." "That pass is a funnel. High ground on both sides. Limited egress routes. Perfect fields of fire for anyone with a rifle and patience. You send a convoy through there, you're asking for casualties. We don't have a choice. The contractors need to get to the forward outpost, and this is the only road that can handle their equipment. Then you send the contractors with a full company of infantry, air support on standby, and you clear every ridgeline before the convoy moves. What you don't do is send 8 SEALs and hope for the best." The major's jaw tightened. "Your concerns are noted, but the mission is approved, and it's happening tomorrow at 0600. Your job is to observe and report, not to second-guess operational decisions." James said nothing. There was nothing to say. He'd given his warning. If they didn't want to listen, that was on them. The blood would still flow just the same. After the briefing, Dylan caught up with him outside. "You think it's that bad?" he asked. James looked at the mountains in the distance. Jagged peaks cutting into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "Your father and I fought in terrain like that," he said quietly. "Basra Highway, 1991. We went in with 30 men, came out with 11. The mountains don't care how good you are, Captain. They don't care about your training or your technology. They just wait." Dylan followed his gaze, and for a moment they stood there in silence. 2 men separated by decades but connected by blood and sacrifice, and the understanding that some debts could never be fully repaid. "I have something for you," Dylan said, pulling a small leather case from his pack. He opened it to reveal a rifle scope, old and worn, with scratches and dings that spoke of hard use. "Found this in my dad's stuff. Letter with it said it was yours. You left it with him for safekeeping before some mission. He was supposed to give it back to you, but..." James took the scope carefully, like it might shatter in his hands. He'd carried this scope through 2 years of operations, had looked through it at targets that became kills, that became numbers, in reports that became classified files no one would ever read. He'd left it with Bobby because he'd been afraid he wouldn't make it back from a cross-border operation into Syria, and he hadn't wanted it to get lost if he died. Bobby had kept it safe for 23 years. "Thank you," James said, and his voice broke on the words. That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk in the transient quarters, staring at the plywood ceiling, listening to the sounds of the base at night, generators humming, guards calling out challenges, the occasional thump of outgoing artillery, the symphony of war, unchanged across generations. He got up, dressed, and walked out into the night. The sky was enormous, stars scattered across the darkness like someone had flung diamonds into the void. He'd forgotten how bright stars could be away from city lights, how small they made you feel. He found himself at the armory, showed his credentials to the night watch, and asked to see their rifle inventory. The armorer, a specialist who looked barely old enough to shave, led him through racks of weapons until they reached a section marked for precision rifles. "We've got M110s, MK13s, couple of Barrett 50s if you need to reach out and touch someone at extreme range," the specialist said. "What are you looking for?" James ran his hand along the weapons, feeling the cold metal, the weight of purpose. "You have any M40s? Old bolt action? Probably in storage somewhere?" The specialist frowned, thinking, maybe, let me check the back. He returned 15 minutes later carrying a case covered in dust. Inside was an M40A1, a rifle that had been old when James retired and was practically ancient now. But it was beautiful in its simplicity, in the way truly functional things always were. Wood stock, worn smooth by 1,000 hands, simple scope mounts, action that would work in any weather, any condition, because there was nothing electronic to fail. "This what you're looking for?" the specialist asked. James picked up the rifle, felt it settle into his hands like it belonged there, like he'd never put it down at all. He worked the bolt, smooth and precise, chambered an imaginary round. "How much ammunition you have for this?" he asked. "Maybe 300 rounds. Nobody's requisitioned it in years. You want to take it out?" "Maybe. Just want to make sure it still works if I need it." The specialist shrugged. "Fill out the paperwork. Far as I'm concerned, rifle's yours as long as you're on base." James signed the forms, took the rifle back to his quarters, and spent an hour cleaning it even though it didn't need cleaning. The routine was meditative, familiar, a connection to all the nights he'd done this before, preparing for missions that might be his last. Oil on the bolt, cloth through the barrel, check the scope mounts, the trigger pull, the safety. When he was done, he wrapped the rifle in a canvas case and set it by his bunk. He told himself he was just being prepared, just maintaining skills that had kept him alive for decades. But he knew the truth. He'd felt it in his bones since the briefing, in the way Dylan had looked at him, in the terrain on the map, in the reports of an enemy sniper who never missed. Something was coming, something that would require more than observation, more than advice. Something that would need a man who could make the hard shots, the impossible shots, the shots that meant the difference between living and dying. At 0400, they assembled for the convoy. 25 personnel, 4 Humvees, 1 MRAP, enough firepower to level a small town, but not nearly enough to control the terrain they were about to enter. Dylan's SEAL team was loose and professional, checking equipment with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times. Morrison was fitting a suppressor to his M110 when he noticed James loading gear into one of the vehicles. "You're coming with us?" Morrison asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Observe or roll," James said. "Can't observe from the base." "You armed?" James patted the pistol on his hip. "Standard sidearm. Observers don't carry rifles." Morrison snorted. "That's going to be real useful if we get hit." James said nothing. The canvas case containing the M40 was already secured under a tarp in the back of the Humvee, along with 300 rounds of ammunition. If anyone asked, he'd say it was testing equipment for the training evaluation. If no one asked, he'd hope he didn't need it. Dawn was breaking as they rolled out of the gate, the sky turning from black to gray to a pale wash of gold. The mountains were silhouettes against the light, massive and ancient, and utterly indifferent to the tiny vehicles crawling through the valley below. James rode in the second vehicle, next to a young Marine named Corporal Davis, who couldn't stop fidgeting with his rifle. The kid was scared, trying not to show it, failing completely. "First convoy?" James asked. Davis nodded. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Major. He trailed off, flustered. "It's all right. I'm retired. No need for formality." James looked out at the passing terrain, the way the shadows fell, the places where an ambush could hide. "You keep your head down, follow orders, and you'll be fine. Most of combat is just doing your job and trusting your team to do theirs." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The convoy climbed into the foothills, the road narrowing as the mountains closed in on both sides. James felt the pressure of it, the weight of stone and history, the sense of entering a place where men had fought and died for centuries and would continue to fight and die for centuries more. They were an hour into the drive when his instincts started screaming. The terrain was wrong. Too many places for an observer to hide. Too few routes for the convoy to escape. The road ahead narrowed even more, forcing them into single file, and the walls on either side rose like the sides of a tomb. James leaned forward, keyed the radio in the vehicle. "Dylan, this is Mackenzie. You need to stop the convoy." Dylan's voice came back, calm but questioning. "What's wrong?" "Everything. This is a kill funnel. We need to turn back or bring in air support before we go any further." A pause. Then Hayes' voice, harder, more authoritative. "Negative, Sergeant Major. We have our orders. Intel says the route is clear." "Intel is wrong. We proceed as planned." James sat back, looked at Corporal Davis's pale face, and felt the old familiar resignation settle over him. He'd given his warning. Now all he could do was wait for the other side to make their move. They made it another 5 minutes before the first shot cracked across the valley. The RPG came from the left, screaming out of a crevice halfway up the cliff face, trailing smoke and death. It missed the lead vehicle by 3 feet and detonated against the rock wall, the explosion sending shrapnel and stone fragments scything through the air. The convoy jerked to a halt, and then chaos erupted. Automatic weapons fire from multiple positions, the distinctive crack of Kalashnikovs echoing off the canyon walls. Morrison was returning fire before James could even process what was happening, his M110 barking in controlled bursts at targets James couldn't see. "Contact left! Multiple shooters! I can't get a lock!" Morrison's voice was tight with frustration. James grabbed his rifle case, tore it open, pulled out the M40. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over, scope mounting, magazine loading, bolt chambering around with a solid metallic click that sounded like finality. "What the hell are you doing?" Davis shouted over the gunfire. James didn't answer. He was already out of the vehicle, moving to cover behind a boulder, scanning the ridgeline through his scope. The crosshairs swept across rock and shadow, looking for the one thing that didn't belong, the one shape that was too regular, too purposeful. Another RPG streaked down from the cliffs. This one found its mark, slamming into the rear Humvee and turning it into a ball of flame. Men were screaming, burning, and James forced himself not to look, not to think about it, because thinking would break him, and right now they needed him cold. He found the RPG team reloading in a depression 800 yards up the slope, calculated windage based on the dust blowing across the rocks, accounted for the angle, the altitude, the way heat rose from the valley floor and bent light into lies. He fired. The rifle punched his shoulder, familiar and brutal, and through the scope he saw the RPG operator jerk backwards, weapon tumbling from dead hands. The loader tried to grab it, and James's second shot put him down too. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed. He was next to James now, spotting through his scope, watching kills happen at distances he couldn't match. "How did you—" "Find me targets," James said, voice flat, professional, the tone of a man doing a job he'd done too many times to count. "I'll handle the rest." The battle turned into a rhythm. Morrison would call out positions, grid coordinates, descriptions of terrain features. James would find the targets, invisible to everyone else, hiding in shadows and behind rocks and in places that should have provided perfect concealment, and one by one he would end them. Somewhere in the middle of it, Dylan's voice came over the radio, tight and controlled despite the chaos. "Shepard, this is Cross. We need suppression on that north ridge. We've got wounded we need to extract." Shepard, the call sign they'd given him in the Gulf back when he'd been a young man learning how to kill and trying to pretend it didn't carve pieces out of his soul. He hadn't heard it in 23 years. Hearing it now in Dylan's voice, Bobby's son's voice, made something twist in his chest. "Roger that," James said, and put 3 rounds into the muzzle flashes on the north ridge. Men stopped shooting, either because they were dead or because they had gotten smart enough to realize staying put meant dying. The firefight lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it finally ended, when the enemy broke contact and melted back into the mountains, the way guerrillas had been doing since the dawn of warfare, the convoy was shattered. 3 vehicles destroyed, 8 men dead, a dozen wounded, some critically. And James stood in the middle of it, rifle still smoking, hands steady, face expressionless, while around him young men stared with the kind of awe usually reserved for miracles or ghosts. Morrison approached slowly, like he was approaching something sacred or dangerous, or maybe both. That was, "I've never seen shooting like that. Not in training, not in combat, not ever." He paused, searching for words. "Who the hell are you?" James looked at him, this young man with his modern rifle and his modern training and his modern confidence that had just been shattered by reality, and felt tired beyond words. Tired of killing, tired of being good at it, tired of needing to be good at it because the world kept creating situations where men like him were necessary. "I'm nobody," James said quietly, "just an old soldier who should have stayed home." But Dylan was there now, holding his wounded shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers, and his eyes were Bobby's eyes, grateful and awed and alive when they could have been dead. "You saved us," Dylan said. "We would have been slaughtered without you." James looked at the burning vehicles, the covered bodies, the wounded being treated by Doc Ramirez with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear. "Saved some of you," he corrected. "Not all." He walked back to his vehicle, every joint aching, shoulder on fire from recoil, hands cramping from gripping the rifle too tight for too long. He was 68 years old. He had no business being in a firefight, But the rifle still worked, his eyes still saw, and his hands still remembered how to turn breathing human beings into corpses at distances most men couldn't comprehend. That night, while they waited for extraction and reinforcements, while the medics worked and the wounded groaned and the dead lay silent under tarps, James sat apart from the others and cleaned his rifle. In the distance, the mountains were black shapes against a purple sky, and somewhere up there, the enemy was watching, waiting, planning the next move in a game that had no end. Morrison came and sat next to him without asking permission. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, the young sniper said, "Teach me." James looked at him, really looked at him, saw past the arrogance and the bravado to the fear underneath, the desperate need to be better because being good wasn't good enough when your brothers were dying. "All right," James said, "but understand something first. What I'm going to teach you, it'll keep you alive. It'll make you deadly, but it'll also change you. There are things you can't unsee once you see them through a scope, things you can't undo once you pull that trigger. You sure that's what you want?" Morrison nodded without hesitation. "Then we start tomorrow," James said, "assuming we survive the night." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, cold and distant and caring nothing for the struggles of men who fought and bled in the darkness below. The mountains watched and remembered, because mountains always did, and in the shadows between the rocks, something else watched too. Something that knew James's name, something that had been waiting 23 years for this moment. And that something was patient, because true hunters always were. The night pressed down on the convoy like a physical weight, darkness so complete it felt like the world had ended beyond the circle of their position. James sat with his back against cold stone, rifle across his knees, watching the ridgelines for movement that never came but was always there, lurking in the spaces between what you could see and what you knew was real. Around him, young men tried to sleep and failed. The wounded groaned softly, doped up on morphine but still feeling phantom pains that no drug could touch. Doc Ramirez moved between them like a ghost, checking bandages, adjusting IVs, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow in the mountain air. Morrison sat 15 feet away, cleaning his rifle for the third time, movements mechanical and obsessive. The kid hadn't spoken since the firefight ended, just kept working the bolt, checking the scope, running patches through the barrel like he could scrub away the memory of targets he'd missed, while an old man beside him hadn't missed once. Dylan Cross was with the command element, coordinating extraction that wouldn't come until dawn, arguing over radio with officers safe in climate-controlled operations centers who couldn't understand why a simple convoy escort had turned into a bloodbath. His voice carried across the night, tight with frustration and pain from the shrapnel wound in his shoulder that he refused to let slow him down. James recognized that voice. He'd used it himself 23 years ago, the tone of a man trying to hold together a situation that wanted to fall apart, trying to keep soldiers alive through sheer force of will when tactics and training weren't enough. Hayes, the chief petty officer, approached James with 2 MREs and a canteen. He sat down without asking, handed over the food. "You need to eat," Hayes said. "We've got a long day tomorrow." James took the MRE but didn't open it. His stomach was a knot of tension and old memories, and food seemed like an insult to the men who died that afternoon. Like enjoying anything was a betrayal of their sacrifice. "I'm fine," he said. "No, you're not. None of us are." Hayes cracked open his own meal, some unidentifiable brown substance that claimed to be beef stew. "But we eat anyway, we sleep anyway, because if we don't, we're no good to the people counting on us." James looked at the chief, really looked at him. Hayes was maybe 38, old enough to have seen real combat, young enough to still think he was invincible. There were scars on his hands, a jagged line across his jaw that spoke of close calls and hard lessons. But his eyes were clear, steady, the eyes of a man who'd made peace with what he did for a living. "You're right," James said, and forced himself to open the MRE. The food was tasteless, but he ate it anyway, mechanically, fuel for a machine that needed to keep running. They sat in silence for a while, 2 warriors from different generations sharing a meal in a place where men had been sharing meals and dying for thousands of years. The mountains didn't care about their stories. The mountains just waited. "Morrison wants you to train him," Hayes said eventually. "He came to me after the fight, asked if we could extend your consultation period." "What did you tell him?" "I told him it wasn't my call, but between you and me, I think it's a good idea. That kid's got talent, but he's got ego too. Watching you work today, seeing what real mastery looks like. It humbled him. That kind of humility might save his life someday. James thought about the targets he'd killed that afternoon. 8 men, maybe 9. He'd lost count after the 5th shot. Each one had been a human being with a story, a family, reasons for fighting that made sense to them, even if those reasons would never make sense to James. He'd ended their stories with precisely placed bullets, turned futures into nothing, and he'd done it without hesitation because hesitation got your brothers killed. I can teach him the mechanics, James said quietly. Windage, elevation, reading terrain. But the other part, the part that lets you sleep after you've killed someone, that's not something you can teach. Either you can live with it or you can't. Can you? James looked out at the darkness, at the shapes that might have been rocks or might have been men, at the infinite black sky scattered with stars that had been there long before humans invented rifles and would be there long after the last shot was fired. I don't know, he admitted. Some days I think I can. Other days I'm not sure I'm actually alive at all. Maybe I died in 91 and everything since has been a dream, a long dream I can't wake up from. Hayes didn't respond to that. What could you say to a man who questioned his own existence? But he didn't leave either. He just sat there, present, solid, a reminder that whatever James was going through, he wasn't going through it alone. Morrison finally finished cleaning his rifle and walked over, movements hesitant, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt or attack. He sat down on James's other side, forming a small circle in the darkness. I counted your shots, Morrison said without preamble. 12 rounds, 9 confirmed kills, maybe 10. Average distance, 800 yards. Longest shot, I'm guessing 1,200 based on the delay between report and impact. He paused. I couldn't have made half those shots on my best day, and I'm supposed to be good at this. You are good, James said. I watched you. Your fundamentals are solid. Your instincts are right, but you're using technology as a crutch. That scope does half your thinking for you, calculates windage and drop automatically. When the conditions get hairy, when the math breaks down because nothing's perfect, you don't have the experience to compensate. So teach me. I intend to, but understand something first. The shots I made today, I've been making shots like that since before you were born. 40 years of practice, 40 years of learning to read wind and dust and distance in echoes. You can't compress that into a few training sessions. Morrison's jaw set stubbornly. Then teach me what you can. Whatever you're willing to share, I'll learn it. James saw determination there, the kind that couldn't be faked or broken by hardship. The kid had been humbled, but humility without determination was just defeat. This was different. This was a warrior recognizing his limitations and choosing to transcend them. All right, James said. First lesson starts now. Look at that ridge line, 2 o'clock, about 600 yards out. Tell me what you see. Morrison squinted into the darkness, brought up his night vision monocular. Rocks, shadows, nothing moving. Now look with your eyes, no technology, just what's there. Morrison lowered the device, stared at the ridge. I still don't see anything. That's because you're looking for something. Look at nothing instead. Let your peripheral vision do the work. Movement catches the edge of your sight before it catches the center. They sat there in silence, watching, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. Hayes had fallen asleep sitting up, the exhaustion of combat finally catching up with him. But Morrison stayed alert, focused, learning patience. Then at the 15-minute mark, a shadow shifted, just barely. A darkness that was slightly wrong, a shape that didn't quite match the terrain around it. There, Morrison whispered. Something moved. Good. Now tell me what it is. I can't tell. Could be a person, could be an animal, could be wind on a bush. Could be all three. Doesn't matter. You saw it. Your subconscious registered an anomaly before your conscious mind processed what it was looking at. That's the first step, learning to trust your instincts even when your brain says there's nothing there. Morrison nodded slowly, still staring at the spot where the shadow had shifted. How do you know when to shoot and when to wait? Context. If we were on patrol, I'd be watching it, marking it, waiting to see if it repeated. If we were actively engaged, I'd put a round near it, see what jumped. Right now, we're in a defensive position with wounded. We don't initiate contact unless we have to. So we watch. We remember. And if something develops, we act. What do you think it was? James smiled, just a little. Probably a goat, but maybe a scout. Won't know unless it moves again. They watched for another 10 minutes, but the shadow stayed still, and eventually Morrison's attention wavered, drifted, the way attention always did when nothing was happening. That was the second lesson, though James didn't say it out loud. You couldn't maintain perfect focus indefinitely. The key was knowing when to focus and when to let your awareness drift, conserving mental energy for when you really needed it. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to a pale wash of rose and gold that made the mountains look almost beautiful. Almost. Beauty was hard to appreciate when you were sitting in a place where men had died yesterday and might die again today. The extraction helicopters arrived with the sunrise, two Black Hawks escorted by Apache gunships that circled overhead like mechanical angels of death. The wounded were loaded first, then the bodies, wrapped in tarps because they didn't have enough body bags. James watched young men carry their dead brothers, faces blank with shock and grief, and felt the weight of every life he'd failed to save pressing down on his shoulders. Dylan Cross supervised the loading, his wounded shoulder bandaged but still functional, giving orders with crisp authority despite the pain he had to be feeling. When the last man was aboard, he walked over to where James stood with his rifle case. "You're not coming with us?" Dylan asked. "Not yet. General Riggs wants a full debrief on what happened here. I'll catch the next flight back to base." Dylan looked at him for a long moment, and James saw Bobby in that look, Bobby's concern and Bobby's protectiveness. "That was something else yesterday, the way you fought. Dad used to tell me stories about you, but I thought they were exaggerated. War stories always are." "They probably were exaggerated," James said quietly. "Your father saw me through the lens of someone whose life I saved, made me better than I was." "No, I don't think so." Dylan reached out, gripped James's shoulder, the universal gesture of warriors acknowledging each other. "Thank you for yesterday, for all the yesterdays I didn't know about, for taking care of us like you took care of him." James couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded. Dylan climbed aboard the helicopter, and moments later the aircraft lifted off, rotors beating the air into submission, carrying away the living and the dead, and leaving James standing in the dust with Morrison and Hayes and a handful of Marines who'd stayed behind for security. The silence after the helicopters left was profound, broken only by wind moving across stone and the distant call of a bird that sounded like morning. Hayes approached, radio in hand. "General Riggs wants to talk to you. Secure channel." James took the radio, keyed the transmit button. "Mackenzie." Riggs's voice came back immediately, tight and clipped. "Jim, we've got a problem. Intel analyzed the attack yesterday. The tactics, the positioning, the precision of fire. This wasn't local insurgents. This was professional work." "I could have told you that during the firefight," James said. "They knew exactly where to hit us, exactly how to use the terrain. Someone planned this." "It gets worse. We pulled ballistics data from the rounds we recovered. The enemy sniper was using a Dragunov SVD, Soviet era. Specific rifling pattern, specific load development. There are maybe a dozen people in the world who shoot that particular configuration." James felt ice forming in his stomach. He knew where this was going before Riggs said it. "We ran it through the database, cross-referenced with known hostile snipers, mercenaries, former Soviet special operations. Got one hit. A pause, heavy with history. Viktor Volkov, former Spetsnaz, long-range reconnaissance. We thought he died in Chechnya in '99, but apparently reports of his death were greatly exaggerated." The name hit James like a physical blow. Viktor Volkov. He'd been a captain in the Soviet advisory team sent to Iraq during the Gulf War, one of the elite snipers training Republican Guard forces in long-range tactics. James had faced him across a valley in southern Iraq in 1991, a duel that had lasted 3 days and ended with James putting a round through Volkov's spotter and watching the Russian retreat, wounded but alive. "He's supposed to be dead," James said, but even as he said it, he knew how stupid it sounded. He was supposed to be a retired civilian living quietly in Montana, and yet here he was in Afghanistan with a rifle and fresh blood on his conscience. People didn't always stay dead in this business. Sometimes they just went underground and waited for their moment. "Well, he's not dead. And according to intercepts we picked up last night, he's specifically hunting you. This whole ambush, it was designed to draw you out. He knew you were on that convoy, Jim. Someone told him." James thought about in the briefing, the major who'd seemed so dismissive of his concerns, the ease with which the mission had been approved despite obvious risks. "There's a leak. We're investigating, But right now, that's secondary. Primary concern is keeping you alive and eliminating Volkov before he kills more of our people. I'm authorizing you for full combat operations. Whatever you need, you've got it. I need information. Everything we have on Volkov. His tactics, his history, his psychology. If I'm going to hunt him, I need to know how he thinks. Sending you a data package now. It'll be on the secure terminal at your location within the hour. Riggs paused again. Jim, be careful. This man is good. As good as you, maybe better. He's been doing this for 43 years and he's survived every attempt to kill him. Don't underestimate him. I won't, but Tom, understand something. If this is personal for him, it's personal for me too. I put a bullet in him once. I should have finished the job. That's on me. Every American who's died to his rifle since then, that's on me. I'm going to fix it. Don't make this about redemption, Jim. That's how good men get killed. It's not about redemption. It's about finishing what I started. James handed the radio back to Hayes and stared at the mountains, seeing them differently now. Not just terrain, but a chessboard. Somewhere up there, Viktor Volkov was looking down, planning his next move, patient and professional, and utterly committed to killing the man who'd wounded him 23 years ago. Two old snipers, two old enemies, meeting again in mountains that didn't care who won as long as blood soaked into the stone. The secure terminal was set up in a cargo container that served as a makeshift TOC, Tactical Operations Center, screens showing satellite feeds and drone footage of the surrounding area. James sat down, accessed the data package Riggs had sent, and began reading. Viktor Volkov, born 1946 in Stalingrad, a city built on the bones of the deadliest battle in human history. Conscripted at 18, showed immediate aptitude for marksmanship, selected for Spetsnaz training, graduated top of his class, deployed to Iraq in 1990 as an advisor to Republican Guard forces, stayed through the coalition invasion in 91. Confirmed kills, classified but estimated over 200. After the Gulf War, operations in Chechnya during the breakaway wars, Syria as a contractor. A lifetime of war, a lifetime of killing, 43 years spent looking through a scope at human beings and reducing them to targets. There were photos. A young man in a Soviet uniform, lean and hard, eyes already showing the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. An older photo from Chechnya, grainy and indistinct, but clearly the same man, now weathered and scarred. A recent image from Syria, captured by a drone showing an old warrior training younger fighters. His face lined with age, but his posture still straight, still strong. James studied the face, trying to remember the man he'd faced across that valley in Iraq in 1991. It had been so long ago and memory was treacherous, editing and revising until you couldn't trust your own recollections. But he remembered the feeling of that duel, the sense of facing someone who was every bit as skilled as he was, every bit as committed to winning. They traded shots for 3 days, neither able to gain a decisive advantage, until James had finally gotten a clearer view of Volkov's spotter and taken him out. The Soviet sniper had withdrawn after that, and James had assumed he'd either killed him or wounded him badly enough that he died later. Apparently, he'd been wrong. The file included a psychological profile, assembled from interrogations of captured fighters who trained under Volkov, from analysis of his tactics, from the pattern of his kills over decades. Patient, methodical, utterly without mercy, but also without sadism. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed because it was his job, his purpose, the thing he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. He was loyal to whoever paid him, but the money wasn't the point. The point was the work itself, the craft of taking a life from a distance so great the target never knew they were in danger until it was too late. The profile concluded with a warning. Subject demonstrates classic symptoms of purpose-driven fixation. When engaged in a mission, will pursue objective regardless of personal risk or changing circumstances. Extreme danger to anyone designated as a target. Approach with maximum caution. James closed the file and sat back, letting the information settle. Volkov wasn't just hunting him for money or political ideology. This was personal. Somewhere in the last 23 years, the Russian had learned who James was, had probably been tracking him the same way James had been living his life, waiting for the right moment. And now that moment had come. Morrison entered the container. Bowen Schoenberger at the container saw James at the terminal, and stopped. "Sorry, sir. Didn't know you were in here." "It's fine. Come in." James gestured to the chair next to him. "You should see this anyway, the man who's hunting us." Morrison sat down, looked at the screen showing Volkov's face. He doesn't look like much, just an old man. He's 68 years old, been a sniper longer than you've been alive, killed more people than most soldiers will ever see in combat. And right now, he's somewhere out there planning how to kill me and everyone who gets in his way. James pulled up a tactical map showing the area around their position. "This is where we got hit yesterday. Now look at the terrain. If you were planning an ambush, where would you position yourself for maximum effectiveness?" Morrison studied the map, tracing possible lines of fire with his finger. "High ground on the eastern ridge gives you overlapping fields of fire on the convoy road, good egress paths if you need to withdraw. That's where their main force was. Now, where would you put your sniper? Your precision shooter?" Morrison looked again, thinking harder. "Further back, somewhere with a clear line of sight to the ambush site, but far enough away that counter-battery fire can't reach you. Maybe here." He pointed to a ridgeline nearly 2 miles from where they'd been hit. That's exactly where he was. "I found 3 of his shooting positions after the battle. Brass casings, matted grass where he'd lain for hours waiting. He was there before we ever entered the valley. He knew we were coming." "How?" "Someone told him. Someone in the chain of command. Someone with access to operational planning. We have a leak, and until we find it, every mission is compromised." Morrison's face darkened. "That's how they killed those other convoys. They knew exactly when and where we'd be vulnerable. And now they know I'm here. Which means Volkov knows. He'll be planning his next move, setting up another ambush, another situation where he can draw me out and take a shot." James zoomed in on the map, highlighting their current position. "We're sitting in a valley surrounded by high ground. Tactically, it's a nightmare, but it's also an opportunity." "How do you figure?" "Because Volkov is old school, same as me. He thinks in terms of patience and position, of setting up the perfect shot and waiting for the target to walk into it. He'll expect me to stay defensive, to hole up here and wait for extraction. What he won't expect is for me to come hunting him." Morrison blinked. "You want to go after him alone?" "Not alone. You're coming with me. Hayes too, if he's willing. Small team, mobile, using the terrain the same way he uses it. Turn this from a defensive situation into an offensive hunt." "That's insane. He knows these mountains. He's had weeks to prepare positions, cache supplies. We'd be walking into his killing ground. We'd be doing exactly what he doesn't expect, which gives us the advantage." James looked at the young sniper, saw the fear and the excitement warring in his expression. "This is lesson 2. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Sometimes you survive by refusing to play the game the way your enemy expects. But it's your choice. I can't order you to come with me." Morrison stared at the map for a long moment, at the mountains and valleys and the infinite places where a man with a rifle could hide and kill. Then he looked at James and his jaw set with determination. "I'm in," he said. "Teach me how to hunt a hunter." Hayes was harder to convince. The chief petty officer listened to James's plan with increasing skepticism, shaking his head every few seconds like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Let me get this straight," Hayes said when James finished. "You want to take one of my operators, leave our defensive position, and go wandering around mountains that are full of hostiles looking for a 68-year-old Russian sniper who's so good at his job that 3 different governments have tried to kill him and failed." "That's the basic idea, yes." "And you think this is a good plan because staying here makes us targets, because air support is unreliable in these mountains, because Volkov won't stop until one of us is dead, and I'd rather control when and where that happens than wait for him to choose." Hayes ran a hand through his hair, looked at Morrison. "You're actually considering this?" "I'm doing it," Morrison said firmly. "This is a chance to learn from the best. And if we don't stop this guy, he's going to keep killing our people. He's going to keep killing our people anyway. That's what he does. That's what he's been doing for 43 years. Hayes turned back to James. "Look, sir, I respect what you did yesterday. You saved lives, no question. But this isn't your war anymore. You're a civilian consultant, not an active operator. If something happens to you out there, it's my ass on the line. So don't authorize it. I'm going with or without permission. Volkov made this personal when he targeted that convoy knowing I was on it. I'm going to finish what I started in '91, and if that means violating a few protocols, so be it." They stared at each other, Two warriors from different eras, different philosophies, testing each other's resolve. Finally, Hayes sighed. 48 hours. That's all I can give you before I have to report you missing. You're not back by then. I'm sending a recovery team. 48 hours is plenty. Either we find him or he finds us. Won't take longer than that. And if he kills you, James smiled without humor, then you'll have one less old man to worry about. And Morrison will have learned a valuable lesson about overconfidence. Hayes looked at Morrison. You die out there. I'm telling your mother it was your idea. Fair enough, Chief. They spent the rest of the day preparing. James stripped his gear down to essentials: rifle, ammunition, water, energy bars, basic first aid. No radio, because radios could be tracked. No night vision, because the batteries would die and Volkov would be watching for the signature anyway. Just the basics, the tools a sniper had relied on for 100 years before technology started doing the thinking. Morrison watched him pack, noting what James took and what he left behind. No GPS? Morrison asked. Maps and compass, GPS can be jammed or spoofed. Paper doesn't lie. No body armor? Weight versus mobility. Out there, speed is armor. Getting hit means you made a mistake, and no vest will save you from a headshot anyway. No long-range radio? Line of sight only. If we get in trouble, we're on our own. Calling for help just tells everyone where you are. Morrison nodded slowly, adjusting his own loadout to match, stripping away the modern conveniences, getting back to basics. It felt both terrifying and liberating, like shedding unnecessary weight before a long climb. As the sun set on their second day in the valley, James and Morrison slipped out of the perimeter under cover of darkness, moving like shadows across terrain that wanted to kill them. Behind them, Hayes watched through night vision, saw them disappear into the mountains, and wondered if he'd just watched two men walk to their deaths. The night was cold, temperature dropping fast once the sun disappeared, thin air at altitude stealing heat from exposed skin. James led the way, moving slowly, deliberately, each step tested before committing weight. Morrison followed, trying to match the old man's rhythm, learning patience through imitation. They climbed for 3 hours without speaking, putting distance between themselves and the defensive position, working their way up the eastern ridge where James had identified Volkov's shooting positions. The terrain was brutal, loose scree that wanted to slide under your boots, hidden crevices that could break an ankle, stones that clicked and clattered if you weren't careful. But James was careful. 40 years of practice had taught him how to move through hostile terrain like a ghost, how to place each foot so the sound was swallowed by wind and distance. Morrison struggled but learned, his youth and strength compensating for inexperience. They reached the first shooting position just after midnight. James knew it immediately, the way a craftsman recognizes another's work. A depression in the ground where a man had lain for hours, grass matted in the exact pattern of a human body. Brass casings carefully collected, but one missed, a 7.62 millimeter round that caught starlight like a tiny beacon. A rock positioned just so, perfect height for a rifle rest. James knelt, touched the ground, felt the ghost of his enemy. Volkov had lain here, had looked through his scope at the convoy below, had calculated wind and distance in the precise moment to fire. He'd killed from here, ended lives with mechanical precision, and then he'd left, disappearing into the mountains like smoke. Morrison whispered, "How long ago?" James brought the brass casing to his nose, smelled it. Cordite faint but still present, the sharp chemical scent of burnt powder. Yesterday, during the fight, he was here watching us. Watching you. Yes. James stood, scanned the surrounding terrain. Volkov would have had an egress route planned, a path he could take to reach his next position without exposing himself to observation. James found it after a few minutes of searching, a narrow gully that led down the backside of the ridge, invisible from the valley below. They followed it, moving even more carefully now because they were following in their enemy's footsteps, and enemies left traps for people stupid enough to follow. But James found no tripwires, no improvised explosives. Volkov was a sniper, not a guerrilla. He killed from a distance, clean and professional. Traps were beneath him. The gully led to a cave, small and well hidden, entrance obscured by rocks that looked natural but had been carefully arranged. James approached it with infinite caution, rifle ready, expecting ambush. But the cave was empty except for what Volkov had left behind. A camp, sleeping bag, water bottles, MREs, a cleaning kit for his rifle, rags and oil and brushes worn smooth from decades of use. A small radio, commercial band, probably for monitoring coalition frequencies, and photos tacked to the cave wall with bits of tape. James played his flashlight across the images and felt his heart stop. There were pictures of James himself, surveillance photos taken over years. James at Fort Benning, teaching. James in Montana, walking to his truck. James at a cemetery, standing over a grave. Dylan Cross was in some of the photos too. And Bobby Cross, old pictures from Gulf War-era archives. There were other faces James didn't recognize, probably other operators Volkov had tracked down over the years. But the centerpiece, the largest photo, showed a young Soviet officer in dress uniform standing next to another man in civilian clothes. The civilian's face had been burned away, leaving a black hole where his features should have been. Written across the bottom in English, "For my brother Alexei, the American sniper took everything." James stared at the photo, understanding flooding through him like cold water. In '91, during that 3-day duel, he hadn't just killed Volkov's spotter. He'd killed Volkov's brother. The man he'd shot through the scope, thinking he was taking out a tactical threat, had been family. And for 23 years, Viktor Volkov had been waiting for the chance to balance that debt. Morrison saw it too, saw the burned face and the inscription. Jesus, this isn't just a job for him, this is revenge. Always was, James said quietly. I just didn't know it. They heard the shot a half-second before the bullet smashed into the cave wall behind them, rock exploding in a shower of fragments that stung like wasps. James dove left, Morrison right, both moving on pure instinct, and a second round punched through the space they just occupied. Volkov had led them here, had left his camp as bait, knowing James would track him to this cave, had positioned himself somewhere in the darkness with a clear line of sight on the entrance, waiting for his prey to walk into the trap. And now the real hunt began. The darkness inside the cave was absolute, a blackness so complete it felt like being buried alive. James pressed himself against cold stone, rifle clutched to his chest, listening to Morrison's ragged breathing 10 feet away and the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs. Outside, the night was silent, except for wind moving across rock, but that silence was a lie. Somewhere in that darkness, Viktor Volkov was settling into position, calculating angles, waiting for one of them to make a mistake. James's mind raced through options, discarding each one as fast as it formed. They couldn't stay in the cave because Volkov had them pinned, could wait them out until dawn and then pick them off when they tried to move. They couldn't go out the entrance because that's where Volkov's rifle was aimed, where he'd already proven he had a clear shot. They couldn't call for help because they'd left the radios behind, and even if they had them, bringing in support would just create more targets. The only way out was through, which meant one of them had to draw Volkov's fire while the other tried to flank him. It was a terrible plan, the kind that got people killed in training exercises, let alone real combat, but it was the only plan they had. Morrison, James whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. You still alive? Yeah, scared shitless, but alive. A pause. He was waiting for us. All of it was a setup. The camp, the photos, everything. He's been hunting me for 23 years. He's not going to give up just because we found his bait. Question is, what do we do about it? We're pinned. He's got us dead to rights from wherever he's positioned. The second we show ourselves, we're done. James closed his eyes, trying to build a mental map of the terrain outside. The cave entrance faced west, overlooking a shallow valley with the opposite ridge 800 yards away. That's where Volkov would be, somewhere on that ridge, using darkness and distance as camouflage. The shot he'd fired had come from slightly south of due west, which narrowed the possible positions, but not by much. There were a dozen places over there where a skilled shooter could hide and still maintain line of sight on the cave. I'm going out, James said. Draw his fire, get him to reveal his position. When he shoots, you watch for the muzzle flash, mark it, then you take the shot. That's suicide, he won't miss twice. He might if I'm moving fast enough, and even if he doesn't, you'll know where he is. That's worth dying for. The hell it is. Morrison's voice had an edge now, anger mixing with fear. You don't get to play martyr here. We're both getting out of this. One of us needs to survive to tell people what happened, to warn them about the leak, to make sure Volkov doesn't just disappear again and keep killing. Then let me be the bait. I'm younger, faster, better chance I can dodge. You don't have the experience. You'd panic, freeze up. I've done this before. James smiled in the darkness, a grim expression no one could see. More times than I can count. Always figured I'd die in some god-forsaken place like this. Might as well be now. Before Morrison could argue further, James moved. He rolled out of cover and sprinted for the cave entrance, boots pounding on stone, making himself a target because that was the plan. That was the only way to save the kid who trusted him enough to follow him into these mountains. The rifle shot cracked across the valley, sound bouncing off rocks in overlapping echoes. James felt the bullet pass so close it tugged at his jacket, felt the supersonic wake like an invisible hand trying to pull him back. He dove behind a boulder outside the cave, heart hammering, adrenaline singing through his veins, and realized with shock that he was still alive. Morrison was at the cave entrance now, rifle up, scanning the opposite ridge through his scope. I saw it. Muzzle flash, 2 o'clock, 750 yards. He's behind that cluster of rocks shaped like a fist. You sure? I'm sure. James risked a glance around the boulder. The ridge Morrison described was barely visible in the starlight, a darker shape against dark sky. The rocks did look like a fist, fingers of stone reaching toward the heavens. It was good cover, good concealment, exactly the kind of position James would have chosen if their roles were reversed. Can you make that shot? James asked. In daylight, yes. In this darkness, I don't know. Scope's good, but it's not magic. I'd be shooting at a shadow. Then we wait for dawn. We've got maybe 2 hours until first light. He can't stay in that position forever. Eventually, he'll have to move, adjust, do something that gives us an opening. They settled in behind the boulder, backs pressed against stone that still held the fading warmth of yesterday's sun, and waited. The wait was harder than the action had been, harder than running through gunfire or making impossible shots. Waiting meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting all the things they'd been pushing away with adrenaline and necessity. Morrison spoke first, voice quiet in the darkness. Tell me about him, about what happened between you two. James was silent for a long moment, organizing memories that had been locked away for decades. Stories he'd never told anyone because the missions were classified and the truth was too hard to speak aloud. But here in the darkness, with death waiting just across the valley, silence seemed like a greater sin than revelation. It was 1991, he began. Different war, same mountains, same stupidity. We'd been tracking a Soviet advisory team that was training Republican Guard forces in long-range reconnaissance. Command wanted them eliminated or captured. Intelligence value was high. My unit drew the short straw. He paused, seeing it all again in his mind's eye. The desert, vast and empty and unforgiving. The heat that never let up. The constant fear of ambush, of mines, of artillery that could kill you from miles away. We found them in a valley south of Basra, set up an overwatch position, waited for our moment. But they had a sniper too, one of the Russians. He spotted us before we could take our shots, and suddenly we were the ones being hunted. Morrison shifted positions, settling in to listen. James could feel the kid's attention, total and focused, the way people listened when they knew the story might save their life someday. It went on for 3 days. Cat and mouse, hunter and hunted, never quite sure who was which. He was good as anyone I'd ever faced. Killed 2 of my team, wounded 3 more. I managed to take out some of his security element, but I couldn't get a clear shot at him. He was too careful, too professional. James's hands tightened on his rifle, knuckles going white in the darkness. On the 3rd day, I finally got my chance. His spotter made a mistake, exposed himself for just a second. I took the shot, watched the man fall. The Russian sniper, Volkov. He tried to reach his partner, expose himself to help. I had him in my crosshairs. Should have taken that shot. Should have ended it right there. Why didn't you? Because I saw his face, saw the anguish, the desperation. Realized the spotter wasn't just a tactical asset, it was personal. And for just a moment, I hesitated. Thought about all the men I'd killed, all the lives I'd ended. Wondered if I could live with one more. James laughed, a bitter sound. Stupidest decision of my life. I let him live. Watched him drag his spotter away across the sand. Thought I'd wounded him badly enough that he'd die anyway, or at least never be a threat again. Filed my report, got a commendation, moved on to the next mission. But the spotter was his brother. I didn't know that until tonight. Didn't know the man I killed was Alexei Volkov, Viktor's younger brother. Didn't know I'd created an enemy who would spend the next 23 years hunting me across half the world. James turned to look at Morrison, though in the darkness it was just looking at a shadow. That's the lesson, kid. Mercy in war is a luxury you can't afford. You get your shot, you take it. No hesitation, no second guessing. Because if you don't, someone else pays the price. How many people has he killed because you let him live? I don't know. Hundreds, probably. Good people, soldiers just doing their jobs. All dead because I had a moment of weakness. James's voice dropped to barely a whisper. That's what I live with. That's why I can't sleep most nights. Not because of the men I killed, but because of the ones I didn't. They sat in silence after that, the weight of history pressing down on them, the sins of the past demanding payment in the present. Somewhere across the valley, Viktor Volkov was having his own conversation with ghosts, his own reckoning with choices made and prices paid. The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly, black fading to the deepest blue, stars dimming one by one like candles being snuffed. James felt the change more than saw it, the way a lifetime of early mornings had attuned him to the subtle shift between night and dawn. Get ready, he said softly. When the sun hits that ridge, he'll have to adjust his position. The light will be behind him, silhouetting him for just a moment. That's your window. Morrison eased into a shooting position, rifle rested on the boulder, scope trained on the cluster of rocks shaped like a fist. His breathing slowed, deepened, the way James had taught him. Good fundamentals, good control. The kid was learning. The sun crept over the eastern peaks like liquid gold, spilling light into the valley, driving away shadows and revealing the world in shades of gray and amber. The opposite ridge came into focus, details emerging from darkness, and James saw the position clearly now. The rocks Volkov was hiding behind, the narrow gaps between them that could accommodate a rifle barrel, the slight depression that would allow him to lie prone and still maintain line of sight. And then, as sunlight touched the ridge, James saw something else. A glint of glass, just for a fraction of a second, a reflection off a scope lens before Volkov adjusted position to compensate for the new light angle. There, James breathed. You see it? I see it? Morrison's finger moved to the trigger, taking up slack. 740 yards, wind negligible, sun angle in our favor. I've got the shot. Wait for him to settle. He's moving to avoid backlight, needs to find a new position. When he does, when he stops moving, that's when you fire. They waited, breath held. The whole world narrowed down to that cluster of rocks and the man hiding behind them. Seconds stretched like hours. James's old heart hammered in his chest, each beat a reminder that he was still alive, still in the fight, still trying to balance accounts that could never be balanced. Volkov settled. James saw it in the way the rocks stopped shifting, the way the morning light fell across stone without any indication of movement. The Russian was in position, rifle aimed, probably looking right at them through his scope, waiting for them to make a mistake. Fire, James said, and Morrison squeezed the trigger. The M110 barked, recoil pushing Morrison back slightly, and across the valley a spray of rock dust exploded from the cluster where Volkov was hiding. A near miss, inches from a kill, close enough to make any man flinch. But Volkov didn't flinch. He returned fire instantly, professionally, 2 rounds in quick succession that hammered into the boulder James and Morrison were using for cover, bullets slamming into stone with enough force to send chips flying. He's good, Morrison said, ejecting his magazine and slamming in a fresh one. I put that round right where he should have been. Should have been isn't good enough. He anticipated the shot, moved before you fired. That's experience talking. James raised his own rifle, the old M40 that had been killing men when Morrison was still in diapers. My turn. He didn't aim at where Volkov was. He aimed at where Volkov would be, calculating movement patterns based on 40 years of doing this exact thing, predicting the next position because he'd been in that position himself 100 times. The Russian would move left, away from the angle of Morrison's shot, seeking cover behind a larger rock that offered better protection. James fired at empty space, at a gap in the rocks where no one was visible, trusting instinct and experience over sight. The bullet flew true, crossing the valley in a flat arc that defied gravity and distance, and somewhere in the rocks across from them, a man cried out. Not a death scream, a grunt of pain, sharp and surprised. James had hit him, but not fatally. A wound, maybe serious, maybe not, but enough to change the tactical situation. Morrison was already repositioning, moving to a different angle, using the confusion to his advantage. I'm flanking right. Keep him pinned. Negative. He's wounded, not dead. Could be faking, could be setting another trap. Or he could be bleeding out right now, which means we need to press the advantage. Morrison was already moving, using cover and concealment the way James had taught him, flowing between positions like water finding cracks in stone. The kid had learned well, maybe too well. The lesson about aggression was taking root, but the lesson about caution hadn't sunk in deep enough yet. James had no choice but to provide covering fire, putting rounds into the cluster of rocks to keep Volkov's head down while Morrison maneuvered. He fired methodically, spacing his shots, making each one count because ammunition wasn't infinite and neither was time. The sun was fully up now, the valley bright and exposed, and anyone with eyes could see them moving. Morrison reached a position 50 yards to the right, a small outcropping that gave him a better angle on Volkov's hide. He signaled to James, ready to engage, and James nodded even though he had a bad feeling about this, a premonition that things were about to go wrong. Morrison rose to fire, and that's when James saw the second position. Another cluster of rocks, 200 yards from the first, and the muzzle flash that erupted from them was like lightning in daylight. The bullet caught Morrison in the center mass, punching through his vest, spinning him around and dropping him behind cover. Volkov hadn't been alone. He'd had a partner in Overwatch, another shooter positioned to cover his flanks, and they'd walked right into the trap because James had been so focused on the primary target, he'd forgotten the first rule of hunting dangerous game. They always hunt in pairs. James ran, abandoning cover, abandoning tactics, running toward Morrison's position because the kid was down and might be dying, and James had already let too many people die because of his mistakes. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, snapping past his head, but he didn't stop, didn't slow, just ran like a man half his age who didn't understand that he should be dead already. He reached Morrison and dragged him deeper into cover, behind rocks that should have been their shield but had become their prison. Morrison's breath came in wet gasps, blood spreading across his chest, eyes wide with shock and pain. I'm hit, Morrison managed. Bad, I think. Can't feel my legs. James tore open the trauma kit he'd been carrying, hands moving automatically through procedures he'd performed 100 times. Chest seal over the entry wound, stopping the sucking sound that meant punctured lung. Pressure on the exit wound, larger and uglier, trying to slow the bleeding that wanted to pour Morrison's life out onto the rocks. You're going to be fine, James said, knowing it was probably a lie, but saying it anyway because hope was all they had left. Stay with me, kid. That's an order. Morrison laughed, a bubbling sound full of blood. Thought you weren't active duty anymore, sir. Can't give me orders. Special circumstances. James got the bleeding under control mostly, enough that Morrison wasn't going to die in the next 5 minutes. But without medevac, without real medical attention, that's all he'd bought them. 5 minutes, maybe 10 if they were lucky. And they were trapped, pinned down by 2 hostile shooters with clear fields of fire. No support, no extraction, no plan except survival that was looking less and less likely with every passing second. Volkov's voice carried across the valley, amplified by a megaphone or just by the acoustics of the terrain. Accented but clear, English learned from decades of killing Americans. James Mackenzie, I know you can hear me. Your boy is dying, yes? Bleeding out while you hide and do nothing. This is how my brother died, slow, painful, calling for me while I could do nothing but watch. James said nothing, just kept pressure on Morrison's wound, kept the kid's eyes focused on his face instead of on the blood that kept seeping through the bandages. I give you choice, Volkov continued. You come out, hands up, rifle down. I kill you quick, one shot, professional. And your boy, he gets to live. I let him go, no more shooting. He can walk back to his base, tell his story, go home to his family. Morrison gripped James's arm, surprisingly strong for someone who'd just taken a bullet. Don't. He's lying. He'll kill us both. Probably, James agreed. But if I don't try, you're dead anyway. This way, maybe you've got a chance. That's not a chance. That's suicide. Son, I've been committing suicide for 40 years. Just been too stubborn to finish it. James checked his rifle, made sure there was a round in the chamber. I'm going to stand up, draw their fire. When I do, you count to 10, then you run. Don't look back. Don't try to be a hero. Just run. I can barely move. Then crawl. Doesn't matter how you do it. Just get out of here. James pressed the M40 into Morrison's hands. Take this. You've earned it. Every mark on that rifle is a reminder that someone lived because someone else died. Add your own marks to it. Make them count. Morrison tried to argue, but James wasn't listening anymore. He was standing up, rifle in one hand, the other hand raised in surrender, walking out into the open where Volkov could see him clearly. The Russian sniper rose from his position too, rifle lowered slightly, face visible for the first time. He was old, 68 like James, weathered and scarred, but standing straight, eyes clear and hard as diamond. A lifetime of war had etched itself into every line of his face, and James saw himself reflected there, saw what he'd become over decades of killing, saw the end of a road they'd both been walking since they were young. You look old, American, Volkov said, voice carrying across the distance. Time has not been kind. Neither has conscience, James replied. I'm guessing you wouldn't know about that. I know about brother. I know about duty. I know about debt that can only be paid in blood. Volkov raised his rifle, smooth and practiced, the motion of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Your debt is due, James Mackenzie. Any last words? James thought about Mary waiting for him in Montana, wondering why he hadn't called. He thought about Dylan Cross, Bobby's son, who trusted him to come back safe. He thought about all the men he'd killed and all the men he'd saved and the impossible calculus of trying to balance one against the other. Yeah, he said, tell my wife I'm sorry. Tell her I tried to come home. Volkov's finger moved to the trigger, and time seemed to slow, the world narrowing down to that single moment of transition between life and death. James closed his eyes, ready for it, almost welcoming it, the final payment on a debt that had been accruing interest for 23 years. The shot, when it came, was deafening. But James didn't feel anything. No impact, no pain, no transition. He opened his eyes, confused, and saw Volkov falling, rifle tumbling from hands that had lost the strength to hold it. Behind the Russian, on a ridge that should have been empty, Dylan Cross stood with a smoking rifle, wounded shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages, face set with grim satisfaction. The SEALs had come. Hayes and the rest of the team, moving through the mountains in the pre-dawn darkness, tracking James and Morrison by the sound of gunfire, arriving at the perfect moment like cavalry in an old western. They'd taken out Volkov's partner first, then held position, waiting for a clear shot at the primary target. Dylan lowered his rifle, keyed his radio. Shepard, this is Cross. We've got you. Stay put. Medevac is inbound. James sank to his knees, adrenaline draining away, leaving him hollow and shaking. He'd been ready to die, had accepted it, almost wanted it, and now he was being denied even that, forced to keep living, keep carrying the weight of all those ghosts. Morrison was still alive when they loaded him onto the helicopter, still conscious enough to grip James's hand and try to speak through a throat full of blood and gratitude. The medics worked frantically, keeping him stable, getting him to a trauma center where surgeons who'd seen worse would piece him back together. Volkov was dead before they reached him, James's bullet having done more damage than he'd realized. The round had clipped an artery, and the Russian had bled out while taunting James, died standing up like he'd lived, rifle in hand until the very end. They found his brother's dog tags in Volkov's pocket, worn smooth from 23 years of carrying them like a rosary. Found letters between the brothers, written in Russian, full of love and loss and promises to avenge. Found a life consumed by a singular purpose. Every decision filtered through the lens of vengeance. Everything sacrificed on the altar of balancing accounts. James sat in the helicopter holding Volkov's effects and felt nothing but exhaustion. The Russian had gotten what he wanted in the end, had died in combat against the man who'd killed his brother. That was probably as close to peace as men like them ever got. Dylan sat next to him, said nothing for a long time. Finally, you were going to let him kill you. He earned it, James said simply. That's not how it works. You don't get to decide you're done living just because you feel guilty. People need you. Morrison needs you. I need you. For what? I'm a relic from a war nobody remembers, fighting enemies that should be dead. You're a teacher, a protector, a reminder that honor and duty still means something. Dylan gestured to the mountains falling away below them. Volkov spent his whole life hunting you for revenge. You spent yours trying to save people. That's the difference. That's what matters. James looked at Bobby Cross's son and saw forgiveness there. The kind that had to be earned but was being offered anyway. A gift he didn't deserve but was being given nonetheless. He thought about Mary waiting for his call, about Morrison fighting for his life because James had taught him to be brave, about all the young warriors who needed old men to show them that survival wasn't just about killing, but about knowing why you killed and being able to live with it after. All right, he said quietly, I'll keep going for now. The helicopter banked west toward the base, toward medical care and debriefing, and the endless bureaucracy of explaining why a retired consultant had ended up in a firefight with a Soviet ghost. Below them, the mountains receded, ancient and indifferent, already forgetting the blood that had been spilled on their slopes. But James would remember, he always remembered. That was his curse and his gift, the burden that kept him alive when it would have been easier to do. He would carry Viktor Volkov's memory the same way he carried all the others. Another ghost in a haunted house that had no room left but made space anyway. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, revealing a world that kept turning regardless of who lived or died in its hidden valleys. And somewhere in that world, other warriors were fighting other battles, making other choices between mercy and duty, creating new ghosts to haunt new old men. The cycle never ended, but at least for today, James had survived it, and that was enough. The field hospital at Bagram smelled like antiseptic and blood, a sterile environment trying and failing to mask the reality of what happened when metal met flesh at high velocity. James sat in a plastic chair outside the operating room, where surgeons were fighting to save Jake Morrison's life, his hands still stained with the kid's blood, his mind replaying the moment when everything had gone wrong and kept replaying it like a broken record he couldn't turn off. Dylan Cross sat beside him, shoulder freshly bandaged, face drawn with exhaustion. Hayes paced in the hallway, boots squeaking on linoleum, checking his watch every 30 seconds like he could force time to move faster through sheer will. The rest of the SEAL team was scattered around the waiting area, young men trying not to show fear, trying to maintain the professional detachment that kept them sane in a profession that specialized in trauma. 3 hours Morrison had been in surgery. 3 hours of not knowing, of waiting for a doctor to emerge and tell them whether the kid would live or die, whether James's decision to go hunting Volkov had cost another young life, another debt that could never be repaid. The door finally opened and a surgeon emerged, still wearing bloodied scrubs, face neutral in that way doctors learned early in their training. James stood up, legs unsteady, feeling every one of his 68 years pressing down on him like a physical weight. "He's alive," the surgeon said, and James felt something unclench in his chest that he hadn't realized was there. Bullet missed his heart by centimeters, collapsed his left lung, did some damage to his liver. "We've stabilized him, but the next 24 hours are critical. If he doesn't develop complications, infection, if his body can handle the trauma, he should make it." "Can we see him?" Dylan asked. "One at a time, 5 minutes maximum. He's sedated, won't be able to talk, but he can probably hear you. Sometimes that helps." The surgeon looked directly at James, and there was something in that look, an understanding between men who'd seen too much death. "You should go first." I think he'd want that. James nodded, unable to trust his voice, and followed the surgeon through doors that sealed behind him with a pneumatic hiss. The ICU was all beeping monitors and humming machines, technology working overtime to keep broken bodies functioning. Morrison lay in the second bed, pale as death, tubes running into his arms and nose, chest rising and falling in a rhythm maintained by a ventilator. James pulled a chair close, sat down, took Morrison's hand carefully, avoiding the IV lines. The kid's skin was cold, clammy, the hand of someone teetering on the edge between life and whatever came after. But his pulse was there, steady and strong beneath James's fingers, a small defiant drumbeat against the darkness. "You did good out there," James said quietly, voice rough. "Better than good. You kept your head, made smart decisions, saved my life more than once. Your instructors would be proud. Hell, I'm proud." Morrison's eyes moved beneath closed lids, some dream or memory playing out in his unconscious mind. James hoped it was a good one, hoped the kid wasn't reliving the moment that bullet punched through him, wasn't trapped in that loop of pain and fear. "I'm sorry," James continued, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I should have seen that second position. Should have anticipated Volkov would have backup. That's on me, not you. You followed my lead and my lead got you shot." He paused, swallowed hard. "If you can hear me, if any part of you is listening, you need to know something. The rifle I gave you, my old M40, it's yours now. Every mark on it represents a choice I made, a life I took to save others. You add your own marks to it. You make your own choices. You don't have to carry my ghosts. You get to create your own story. A nurse appeared at the doorway, gestured that his time was up. James stood, squeezed Morrison's hand once more. Fight, kid. You've got too much left to do to quit now. He walked out of the ICU feeling hollowed out, emptied of everything except a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep would fix. Dylan was waiting, moved past him into the room without a word. Hayes caught James's arm, guided him to a quiet corner away from the others. General Riggs is flying in tomorrow, Hayes said, keeping his voice low. Wants a full debrief on what happened. He's bringing someone from intelligence, counterintelligence specifically. They found the leak. James's head snapped up, exhaustion forgotten. Who? They wouldn't say over unsecured channels, but apparently it goes higher than anyone expected. High enough that Riggs is scared, and I've never seen that man scared of anything. Hayes glanced around, making sure they weren't being overheard. There's something else. Volkov's body, they did a full workup, found documents, encrypted communications, bank records. He wasn't working alone, Shepard. This was bigger than just one Russian with a vendetta. How much bigger? That's what Riggs wants to talk to you about. Privately. Just you and him and the intelligence people. Hayes' grip on James's arm tightened. Whatever this is, it's bad, and you're in the middle of it. James thought about the photos in Volkov's cave, the surveillance images spanning years, the resources required to track someone across continents and through classified assignments. That kind of operation required funding, support, access to information that shouldn't exist outside of classified databases. One old Russian sniper, no matter how skilled, couldn't manage that alone. When does Riggs arrive? 0800 tomorrow. He wants you rested, clean, ready to think clearly. His words. Hayes released James's arm. Go get some sleep, Shepard. You look like death. I feel like death. Yeah, well, feeling it and being it are two different things. Morrison needs you alive and functional. Whatever's coming, we're going to need the legend, not the ghost. James wanted to argue that he was both, that the legend and the ghost were inseparable, two sides of the same coin that had been in circulation for too long. But Hayes was right about needing rest, and arguing would just waste energy he didn't have. He found a bunk in the transient barracks, lay down without bothering to remove his boots, and immediately fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. Dreams came, vivid and violent, mixing past and present into a surreal landscape where Bobby Cross and Viktor Volkov fought side by side while James watched through a rifle scope he couldn't pull the trigger on. He woke gasping, disoriented, to find dawn light streaming through the window and someone knocking persistently on the door. Shepard, you in there? Riggs is here. Time to talk. James dragged himself upright, splashed water on his face from a sink that dripped rusty liquid, and tried to make himself presentable. The face in the mirror was ancient, lined and scarred, eyes sunk deep with exhaustion and trauma. He barely recognized it as his own. The briefing room was small and windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly corpse-like. General Riggs sat at the head of a table, looking older than James remembered, worry etched into every line of his face. Next to him was a woman in civilian clothes, maybe 40, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. Two MPs stood by the door, hands resting on sidearms, which told James this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Jim, sit down, Riggs said without preamble. This is Special Agent Catherine Reeves, Defense Intelligence Agency. She's been investigating the leak that compromised your operations. James sat, folded his hands on the table and waited. Years of debriefings had taught him to let the other side talk first. Give them enough rope to either hang themselves or pull him to safety. Reeves opened a folder, slid a photo across the table. A man in an Army major's uniform, maybe 50, unremarkable except for the calculating look in his eyes. Major Douglas Hendricks, operations officer at CENTCOM. He was the one who approved your convoy mission, who knew your route and timing, who had access to classified files on your background. Was? James picked up the photo, studied the face. Something about it triggered a memory, distant and hazy. A briefing room years ago. A younger officer asking questions about classified operations. Was, Reeves confirmed. He was found dead in his quarters 3 days ago. apparent suicide, single gunshot to the head, service pistol in his hand, note confessing to passing information to hostile forces. She paused. Except it wasn't suicide. Forensics found defensive wounds, signs of a struggle, injection marks on his neck. Someone made it look like suicide, and they did a good job, but not good enough. So Hendricks was the leak, but someone killed him before he could talk. Exactly. And that someone had access to the base, to his quarters, to enough information to make the scene look convincing. Reeves leaned forward. We identified the killer through security footage. Staff Sergeant William Chen, Supply NCO, assigned to base logistics for 8 months. He disappeared the same night Hendricks died. We found his body yesterday in the mountains, execution style, someone cleaning up loose ends. Who killed Chen? We're still working on that. But here's what we know. Hendricks wasn't working alone. His computer had files on you dating back to the Gulf War, information that should have been buried in archives so deep nobody could access them without presidential authorization. Someone gave him that information. Someone wanted Volkov to know exactly who you were and exactly how to hurt you. James felt ice forming in his stomach. You're saying this goes higher than a corrupted major and a supply sergeant. You're saying someone in the intelligence community has been feeding information to hostile actors. We're saying there's a network, Riggs said grimly. Former Soviet operatives, mercenaries, corrupt officials, all working together. Volkov was just one piece, Hendricks was another, Chen was cleanup. But the person running it, the architect, we don't know who they are yet. But they know who we are, James said. They know I killed Volkov. They know Morrison's in the ICU. They probably already have a contingency plan. Reeves nodded. Which is why we're locking down this base, restricting access, vetting every person who comes into contact with you or your team, and why you're not leaving here until we identify and eliminate the threat. So I'm a prisoner. You're protected, Riggs corrected. There's a difference. Is there? James stood up, suddenly furious. 23 years of taking orders and following protocol boiling over. I came here to observe training, got dragged into a firefight, hunted by a ghost from my past, watched a good kid get shot because someone up the chain decided my life was worth sacrificing to flush out a network. And now you're telling me I can't leave, can't do anything except sit here and wait for the next assassin to take their shot? Jim, sit down, Riggs said, voice hard. No, I'm done sitting. I'm done being bait. You want to catch whoever's running this network? Fine. But you're going to do it without using me or my people as target practice. The two MPs moved toward him, hands dropping to their weapons. James tensed, ready for confrontation, ready for whatever came next, because anything was better than being trapped in this cycle of violence that never ended. Then Dylan Cross opened the door, walked in without invitation, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Stand down, Dylan said to the MPs, voice carrying command authority despite his wounded shoulder. Sergeant Major Mackenzie isn't under arrest, isn't under investigation, and isn't going anywhere until we're done talking. He looked at Riggs. Sir, with respect, you can't keep him here against his will. He's a civilian, and threatening him with armed guards makes us look like the bad guys. Riggs stared at Dylan for a long moment, then nodded to the MPs. They stepped back, relaxed their stance, but didn't leave. Small victories. Captain Cross is right, Riggs said. Jim, you're not a prisoner, but you are in danger, and we need your cooperation to keep you alive while we unravel this mess. James sat back down, tension draining away as quickly as it had come. What do you need from me? Everything you remember about Viktor Volkov. Every conversation, every detail from 1991 and yesterday. Somewhere in that history is a clue to who he was working with, who funded his operation, who wanted you dead badly enough to burn a network asset like Hendricks. For the next 4 hours, James talked. He reconstructed the 91 duel in the Iraqi desert, described every shot, every movement, every moment of that 3-day hunt. He went through yesterday's fight in excruciating detail, from the moment they'd found Volkov's cave to the instant Dylan's bullet had ended the Russian's life. He described the photos on the cave wall, the surveillance images, the burned face of Alexei Volkov, and the inscription promising vengeance. Reeves recorded everything, occasionally asking questions that seemed random, but James recognized as an interrogator's technique, circling back to details, looking for inconsistencies or forgotten information. She was good at her job, thorough and relentless, the kind of person who wouldn't stop until she'd extracted every bit of useful intelligence. When they finally finished, James felt wrung out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Talking about it, reliving it, had opened wounds he'd thought were scarred over, exposed nerves he'd been protecting with carefully maintained emotional distance. "Thank you," Reeves said, closing her notebook. "This gives us several new leads to pursue. The surveillance equipment Volkov used, the encryption on his communications, the banking records showing payments from offshore accounts. We'll trace it all, find the source." "How long will that take?" "Days, maybe weeks. These things don't move fast." Morrison doesn't have weeks. If this network knows he survived, knows he can identify tactical patterns and positions, he's a loose end they'll want to tie up. "We're protecting him, armed guards, restricted access, full security protocols." That didn't stop them from killing Hendricks on a secure military base. James looked at Riggs. "You know I'm right, Tom. The kid's a target now, same as me, and hospital security isn't going to stop a professional." Riggs was quiet for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, he nodded. "We'll move Morrison to a secure facility stateside as soon as he's stable enough to fly. Probably 48 hours. Until then, we increase security, rotate guards, limit access to essential personnel only. I want to be on his security detail. Jim, you need rest. I need to keep that kid alive. It's my fault he's in there. I owe him that much." Dylan spoke up. "I'll stay with him too, round the clock, rotating shifts. Nobody gets near Morrison without going through us first." Reeves looked skeptical. "You're both exhausted, wounded, operating on adrenaline and guilt. Not exactly optimal for security work." "Maybe not," Dylan agreed, "but we're also the only people in this base who've been hunting and being hunted for the last week. We know what to watch for. We know how professionals operate, and we're not going to fall asleep on duty because we understand what's at stake." Riggs looked between them. Two warriors from different generations united by blood and duty and shared trauma. "All right, 12-hour shifts, minimum 4 hours sleep between. But if either of you shows signs of breaking, I'm pulling you and putting fresh security on it. Clear?" "Clear," James and Dylan said in unison. The hospital's ICU had been transformed into a fortress. Barriers channeled traffic through a single checkpoint, where armed Marines scrutinized IDs and checked against an approved personnel list. Inside, Morrison's room had been moved to a corner position with no windows and only one entrance. 2 guards stood outside, another inside, all of them SEAL team members Hayes had personally vetted. James took the first shift, settling into a chair in the corner of the room with a clear line of sight to the door and to Morrison's bed. The kid was still unconscious, still hooked to machines that beeped and hummed their mechanical lullaby. But his color was better, his breathing stronger. The surgeon had been cautiously optimistic during evening rounds, saying Morrison had made it through the critical period without complications, that his body was fighting to heal itself. Young bodies did that, bounced back from trauma that would kill older men, knitted themselves together through sheer, stubborn vitality. James envied it even as he was grateful for it, knowing Morrison would walk away from this eventually, would carry scars but not the kind that never healed. The night passed slowly, broken only by nurses coming and going, checking vitals, adjusting medications, doing the endless, small tasks that kept patients alive. James watched them all with the same intensity he'd once watched enemy positions, looking for the detail that didn't fit, the wrong movement, the tell that separated legitimate personnel from someone with hostile intent. At 0300, a new nurse appeared, female, maybe 30, with the kind of forgettable face that made her perfect for blending into hospital environments. She had the right ID badge, the right scrubs, the right equipment card. But something about the way she moved set off alarms in James's head. Some instinct honed by 40 years of staying alive when people wanted him dead. She entered the room, smiled at James. "Just need to check his vitals and change his IV bag." "Show me your hands." The smile faltered. "Excuse me?" "Your hands. Show them to me." Slowly, she raised her hands, palms out, and that's when James saw it. Calluses on the inside of her index finger and thumb, the kind you got from years of pulling triggers. Real nurses had different calluses, from writing notes and handling equipment. These were a shooter's hands. James was moving before conscious thought caught up, launching himself out of the chair, closing the distance. The nurse went for something under her scrubs, but James was faster. slamming her against the wall, pinning her arm, fingers finding and crushing the syringe she'd been reaching for. The guards burst through the door, weapons drawn, just as the woman tried to break free, using techniques no nurse would know, combat training that marked her as thoroughly as her calluses had. They wrestled her to the ground, cuffed her, dragged her out while she stayed silent, face blank, giving them nothing. Hayes arrived minutes later, having sprinted from the command center when security alerted him. What the hell happened? They sent someone for Morrison, James said, still breathing hard from adrenaline. Professional, well prepared, almost got through. If I hadn't noticed her hands, he'd be dead. Hayes examined the syringe, now contained in an evidence bag. We'll get this analyzed, find out what was in it, and we'll interrogate her, find out who sent her. She won't talk. People like that, they're prepared for interrogation, trained to resist. By the time you break her, if you break her, whoever sent her will have already activated a backup plan. James looked at Morrison, still unconscious, unaware how close he'd just come to dying. We need to move him now, not in 48 hours. Now. He's not stable enough for transport. He's not safe enough to stay. James grabbed Hayes' arm, squeezed hard enough to get his full attention. Chief, they're not going to stop. They'll keep sending people until one of them gets through. The only way to keep him alive is to move him somewhere they don't know about, somewhere off the grid. Hayes was quiet, thinking, weighing risks against rewards. I might know a place. Private facility, handles special operations casualties, completely off the books. But getting Morrison there without anyone knowing, that's going to be complicated. Complicated is better than dead. All right, I'll make the calls, get it set up. But we're going to need a diversion, something to make them think Morrison's still here while we move him. Dylan appeared in this doorway, having heard the commotion. Use me, put me in his bed, same equipment, same security. Anyone watching will think it's still Morrison. By the time they figure out they've been had, he'll be long gone. That puts you in the crosshairs, James said. Good, I'm already in them anyway. Might as well be useful bait. Dylan's jaw set with the same stubborn determination his father had shown, the cross-family trait of volunteering for the worst assignments because someone had to do it. Besides, if they come for me, they'll find out SEALs don't die as easy as they think. The plan came together quickly after that, pieces falling into place with the smooth efficiency of people who'd spent their lives operating in chaos. They moved Morrison in the pre-dawn darkness, loaded him into an ambulance marked for routine medical transport, surrounded by guards in plainclothes who looked like nothing more than tired medical personnel ending a long shift. James rode in the ambulance, watching Morrison's monitors, ready to perform CPR if the kid's heart decided moving was too much stress. But Morrison held stable, his young body adapting to circumstances the way young bodies did, fighting to survive because that's what life did when death tried to claim it early. The facility Hayes had arranged was 2 hours outside Bagram, hidden in the mountains in a compound that had once belonged to some warlord and now served as a medical black site for operations that officially didn't happen. The doctors there were used to treating bullet wounds and shrapnel damage without asking questions, used to patients who arrived without names and left without records. They transferred Morrison to a private room that looked more like a bunker than a hospital. Concrete walls thick enough to stop anything short of artillery, one entrance that could be locked and defended. The head physician, a gray-haired woman with the no-nonsense attitude of someone who'd worked in war zones for decades, examined Morrison with practiced efficiency. He'll live, she pronounced, probably wake up in the next 24 hours. When he does, he's going to have questions. Tell him the truth, James said. Tell him he's alive because people decided he was worth saving. Tell him he's got a chance to start over, make different choices, live without the weight I've been carrying. The doctor studied James with eyes that had seen too much suffering. You planning on being here when he wakes up? No, I've got ghosts to put to rest. And I can't do that while I'm standing watch over someone else's future. He left Morrison sleeping in that bunker room, left him in the care of professionals who would patch him back together, and walked out into dawn light that felt like judgment and absolution mixed together. Dylan was waiting by the vehicle, shoulder bandaged, face drawn but determined. Where to now? Dylan asked. Back to base. I've got a meeting with Reeves. She says they've traced some of Volkov's communications, found connections to people in the intelligence community. I want to know who's been pulling the strings, who turned my past into ammunition against the present. And then I'm going home, back to Montana, back to Mary, back to a life that doesn't involve killing people or watching them die. I'm done, Dylan. This is my last mission. Dylan looked at him, seeing the exhaustion and the conviction both, understanding that some decisions couldn't be argued with. Will you really be able to walk away after everything? James thought about Morrison in that bunker room, thought about Bobby Cross in a grave in North Carolina, thought about Viktor Volkov dead in the mountains with his brother's dog tags in his pocket. All the ghosts he carried, all the debts he tried to balance. I don't know, he admitted, but I have to try, because if I don't, I'll end up like Volkov, consumed by the past, unable to let go, dying for a cause that stopped mattering years ago. That's not the man I want to be. That's not the man you are. Maybe? We'll find out soon enough. They drove back to Bagram in silence. Two warriors from different generations bound by blood and duty, heading toward a confrontation that would determine whether the cycle of violence could finally be broken or whether it would continue spinning forever, grinding up new lives to feed its endless hunger. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning cold, revealing a world that kept turning regardless of individual suffering. And somewhere in that world, the people who'd orchestrated this web of death were watching, waiting, planning their next move. But James was planning too, and after 40 years of war, he'd learned one essential truth. The best way to end a fight was to make the enemy think they'd won, then hit them when they relaxed their guard. He'd been bait once. He could be bait one more time. But this time the trap would be his, and the price would be paid by those who'd turned duty into betrayal, honor into assassination, service into sin. One last mission, one last hunt, and then, finally, he could rest. The intelligence briefing room had changed since James's last visit. Now it was filled with satellite imagery, intercepted communications transcripts, financial records spread across 3 tables like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. Special Agent Reeves stood at the center of it all, circles under her eyes, speaking to 72 hours without sleep, her voice hoarse from briefing after briefing to officials who didn't want to believe what she was telling them. We've traced the network back through 4 shell corporations, 6 offshore accounts, and a web of former intelligence operatives that spans 3 decades, she said, pointing to a chart that looked like a spider's web drawn by someone having a nightmare. At the center of it all, we keep hitting the same name, Colonel Richard Morrison, retired CIA, former station chief in Baghdad during the Iraq War, currently living under protected status in Virginia. James felt the world tilt sideways. Morrison, not related to Jake Morrison, the kid fighting for his life in that bunker hospital. Different Morrison entirely. But the coincidence of the name felt like the universe playing a cruel joke, reminding him that some debts got paid in the strangest currencies. I know him, James said quietly. Worked with him on operations in Iraq, 2003 to 2005. He was the liaison between special operations and intelligence. Good officer, smart, ruthless when he needed to be. Apparently he got more ruthless after his son died, Riggs said, his face carved from granite. We've connected him to the sale of classified information going back to 2004. Names of operatives, mission details, target packages. He's been running his own private intelligence service, selling to whoever paid the most. Former Soviet operatives, Chinese, arms dealers, terrorist organizations. Didn't matter to him as long as the money was good. And Volkov worked for him? Volkov was his instrument of revenge. Morrison had a son, Marcus, who died in Fallujah in 2004. Marine Force Recon killed during a classified operation that went bad. Morrison blamed the military, blamed the government, blamed everyone except himself for encouraging the boy to enlist. Reeves pulled up a photo, a young man in dress blues, earnest face full of the idealism that got ground out of you after your first combat deployment. He spent the last 10 years building this network, using it to undermine operations, get people killed, all as some twisted form of payback. James stared at the photo of Marcus Morrison and saw echoes of every young soldier he'd ever known. Every kid who'd signed up thinking war was glory and honor and came home in a box or not at all. He understood the father's grief, the rage at a system that consumed sons and spat out flag-draped coffins. But understanding didn't mean forgiving. Grief didn't justify treason. Why me? James asked. Why send Volkov after me specifically? Because you trained Marcus Morrison, Reeves has said, sliding another file across the table. Fort Benning 2003, Advanced Marksmanship Course. You were the primary instructor. Marcus wrote letters home about you, about how you were the best he'd ever seen, how he wanted to be like you. The memory came flooding back, hazy and incomplete. A class of 30 soldiers, Marcus Morrison, one face among many, talented but not exceptional, eager but not outstanding. James had pushed them all hard, trying to give them skills that might keep them alive when the shooting started. And then they'd graduated and scattered to different units and different deployments. And James had moved on to the next class, the next batch of young men who needed teaching. He hadn't known Marcus had died, hadn't known the kid he'd spent 8 weeks training had ended up bleeding out in some Fallujah street, calling for his father the way young men always did when they were dying. Hadn't known that teaching the boy had made James complicit in his death in the eyes of a grieving father who needed someone to blame. Morrison blames me for his son's death, James said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. He blames the entire system, but you were the face he could put on it, the name he could attach to his rage. When he learned you'd killed Alexei Volkov back in 1991, he saw an opportunity. Contacted Viktor, offered him funding and intelligence in exchange for eliminating you. Two birds with one stone. Volkov gets his revenge, Morrison gets his, and both of them get to feel like they've balanced accounts that can never actually be balanced. James thought about the interconnected web of violence and vengeance. How one death in 91 had led to another in 2004 had led to yesterday's bloodshed in the mountains. The cycle never ended because people couldn't let go, couldn't accept that sometimes bad things happen, not because someone was evil, but because war was chaos, and chaos consumed the good and bad alike, without discrimination. Where is he now? James asked. Morrison. That's the problem, Riggs said. He's disappeared. Left his house in Virginia 3 days ago, hasn't been seen since. We've got alerts at every airport, border crossing, port. But he's been in the intelligence game for 30 years. He knows how to vanish. He's not running, James said with certainty. He's coming here. Volkov failed, so he's going to finish it himself. That's what I'd do if I were him. Can't trust anyone else to get the job done right. Reeves and Riggs exchanged glances, the kind of look people shared when they realized the person they were talking to understood the enemy better than they wanted to admit. We've increased security across the base, Reeves said. Every person who enters gets vetted, every vehicle searched. If he tries to come here, we'll catch him. You won't. James stood up, feeling the old familiar weight settling onto his shoulders, the burden he'd carried for 40 years and thought he'd finally put down. He won't come through the gates. He's already inside. That's how he stayed ahead of you. Morrison had Staff Sergeant Chen killed to cover his tracks, which means he has other assets on this base. Sleeper agents he's cultivated over years. One of them got him inside the wire probably days ago. Riggs's face went pale. How certain are you? Certain enough to bet my life on it, which is exactly what I'm going to do. Jim, we can lock down the entire base, search every building, and tip him off that you know he's here. Then he goes to ground, waits for another opportunity, kills someone else to create confusion. No, I give him what he wants. Me, exposed, vulnerable, impossible to resist. And when he takes his shot, we're ready for him. Dylan spoke up from where he'd been standing, silent in the corner. That's suicide. That's tactics. Morrison wants me dead because he thinks it'll give him peace, close the circle, end the pain. I let him think he's got his chance, and when he commits, when he's focused entirely on pulling that trigger, you take him out. And if we miss, if he gets his shot off first, James shrugged. Then at least it's finally over. After 40 years, that's not the worst ending. The argument that followed was loud and heated, with Riggs insisting they could find Morrison through conventional means, and Reeves worried about the political fallout if a civilian consultant got killed on a military base. But James wore them down through sheer stubborn insistence, the way he'd been wearing down objections for 4 decades. And finally they agreed to his plan, with the caveat that Dylan and a sniper team would have him covered from multiple angles. They set it up for the following morning. A scenario that would look like James taking a routine walk to clear his head, following a path that offered multiple shooting positions for someone watching from inside the base perimeter. The SEAL snipers would be pre-positioned in hide sites, thermal imaging cameras would sweep potential locations, and Dylan would be shadowing James from 200 yards back, ready to provide immediate response if things went wrong. It was a good plan, professional and thorough. James gave it about 50-50 odds of working, which were better odds than he'd faced in most of his career. That night, he called Mary from a secure phone in his quarters. She answered on the second ring, and just hearing her voice made something in his chest unclench. "Jim, where are you? You were supposed to call 3 days ago." "I know, I'm sorry. Things got complicated." He tried to find words that would explain without revealing classified information settled for inadequate truth. "I'm in Afghanistan. There was a situation. People got hurt. I'm okay, but I might not be coming home as soon as I thought." Silence on the other end, the kind of silence that spoke volumes about 40 years of marriage to a man who had spent most of it in war zones. Then, "How bad is it?" "It's manageable. But Mary, I need you to know something. If things go wrong, if I don't make it back, it's not because I didn't fight to come home. It's not because I didn't love you enough to survive. Sometimes the universe demands payment for old debts, and mine have been accumulating for a long time." "Don't talk like that. Don't you dare talk like you've already given up." "I haven't given up. I'm just being realistic. I'm 68 years old, fighting battles that should have ended decades ago. Eventually, age catches up with skill. Eventually, luck runs out. Then make sure tomorrow isn't that day." Her voice was fierce now, the tone she used when she was scared but refused to show it. "You come home, James Mackenzie. You hear me? You finish whatever you need to finish, and you come home. I'm not burying you. I'm not spending the rest of my life wondering if I said the right things in our last conversation." "I love you," he said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. "I have always loved you. You're the only thing that kept me human all these years." "Then prove it by surviving. I'll be waiting." The line went dead. James sat holding the phone for a long time, staring at nothing, thinking about the cabin in Montana and the life he'd built there, the peace he'd found in her arms after so many years of violence. That was worth fighting for, worth surviving for. He just had to make it through one more day. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning where every detail stood out in sharp relief, where distance seemed compressed and the whole world felt close enough to touch. James dressed in civilian clothes, unremarkable and unmilitary, and walked out of his quarters like a man without a care beyond getting some exercise. The path he followed wound through the base perimeter, close enough to buildings that someone hiding inside would have a clear line of sight, far enough from crowds that there'd be minimal collateral damage if shooting started. Every step felt measured, deliberate, walking a tightrope between looking natural and presenting a target. He could feel the sniper teams watching him, invisible in their hide sights, thermal scopes tracking his movement. Could feel Dylan somewhere behind him, ready to sprint forward if things went bad. Could feel the weight of all those eyes on him, all those people whose lives depended on this working. And somewhere on the base, he could feel Richard Morrison watching too, settling into position, calculating windage and distance, preparing to take the shot that would finally ease the pain of losing his son. James walked for 20 minutes, following the pre-planned route, giving Morrison time to commit, time to focus, time to make the mistake of thinking this was real and not a carefully orchestrated trap. He tried not to think about what a bullet would feel like punching through him, tried not to imagine the moment of impact, the transition from alive to dying. Fear was useless now. Either the plan worked or it didn't. Either he went home to Mary or he didn't. Control was an illusion. All he could do was trust his team and hope the universe wasn't ready to collect its debt today. The shot, when it came, wasn't from outside the perimeter. It came from a supply building 40 yards to James's left. The crack of a rifle echoing off buildings and wire and shocking everyone, because Morrison wasn't supposed to be able to hide inside his secured structure, wasn't supposed to be able to breach security that had been triple-checked. James felt the bullet pass, felt the supersonic wake tug at his shirt, and dove for cover behind a concrete barrier, training overriding thought, body moving before brain processed what was happening. Dylan was sprinting toward him, rifle up, scanning for the shooter. The SEAL teams were repositioning, trying to get angles on the supply building. And in that building, Richard Morrison was already moving, already executing his escape plan, because he'd known this was a trap, had known they'd be waiting for him, and had done exactly what James would have done and hidden where no one expected him to be, inside the wire, among them, for days. "He's inside the perimeter," James shouted into the radio he'd been carrying. "Supply building, north side. He's going to rabbit, try to lose himself in the base population." Security forces were converging, sealing exits, locking down sectors. But bases were designed to let personnel move freely, not to trap infiltrators who knew the layout. Morrison had probably been inside for a week, living in plain sight among supply personnel, waiting for his moment. The corrupted guard who'd let him in was likely already dead, another loose end tied up. James ran toward the supply building, Dylan shouting at him to wait for backup. But James couldn't wait because Morrison would be gone in 60 seconds, would disappear into the maze of structures and vehicles and anonymous soldiers, and they'd never find him before he found another angle, another shot, another way to finish what he'd started. He hit the building's entrance at a dead run, rifle up, clearing corners the way he'd done 1,000 times in 1,000 different buildings across 40 years of war. The interior was dim, full of equipment and supplies and places to hide. He moved through it methodically, checking every shadow, every gap, every space large enough to conceal a man. Found Morrison in the back, near an emergency exit, struggling with a lock that should have opened but had been jammed by base security responding faster than expected. The old CIA officer turned, and for a moment they faced each other across 10 feet of space. Two old men with rifles and grudges and more history than either could carry. Morrison was 70, lean and hard, face weathered by decades of clandestine work in hostile environments. His eyes were the worst part, empty in the way eyes got when you'd seen too much suffering and stopped feeling it. James recognized those eyes. He saw them in the mirror every morning. "James Mackenzie," Morrison said, voice calm despite the rifle pointed at him. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you face to face. You could have just called, would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Where's the satisfaction in that? Where's the justice?" Morrison's hand stayed on his own rifle, finger near the trigger, neither man willing to be the first to fire. "You trained my boy," filled his head with ideas about duty and honor and service, made him think being a warrior was noble, and then you sent him off to die in some Fallujah street that didn't matter to anyone. "I didn't send him anywhere. I taught him skills. He chose how to use them. He was 22 years old. He didn't know enough to choose. You should have told him the truth. That war isn't noble. It's just butchery. That service means dying for politicians who don't care about you. That honor is just a word they use to make you feel better about killing." James lowered his rifle slightly, not dropping it but showing he wasn't looking for a fight. "You're right. I should have told him all that. Should have told every kid I trained that the things we taught them would haunt them forever if they lived and kill them early if they didn't. But if I'd done that, who would have defended the country? Who would have stood the wall? Let it fall. Let the whole rotten system fall. Better that than feeding it our children one generation at a time." Is that what you told yourself when you started selling secrets? When you got American soldiers killed to balance your personal account? That you were bringing down a corrupt system? Morrison's face twisted, grief and rage mixing into something ugly. "I was making them pay. Every operation I compromised, every soldier who died because of intelligence I sold, that was payment for Marcus. That was justice. That was murder. Those soldiers had families too, had mothers and fathers who loved them just like you loved Marcus. You didn't balance anything. You just added more bodies to the pile. Don't lecture me about morality. You've killed more people than I ever will. What makes your killing righteous and mine criminal?" James was quiet for a moment, thinking about that question, about all the ghosts he carried and the justifications he'd made for carrying them. "Nothing, SA," he finally said. "We're both killers, both broken by what we've done and what's been done to us. The only difference is I'm trying to stop. I'm trying to find a way to live with it. You're still looking for revenge, and revenge never ends. It just creates new cycles, new victims, new people like us who can't let go." "Then what do you suggest? I just forget about my son, pretend his death meant nothing?" "I suggest you remember him for who he was, not how he died. I suggest you honor his memory by building something instead of destroying everything. I suggest you stop making the world worse because you're in pain." Morrison laughed, a broken sound. "It's too late for that. I crossed too many lines. There's no coming back from what I've done." "There's always a choice. Right up until the moment you pull that trigger, you have a choice." They stood there in the dim supply building, two old warriors at the end of long roads that had led to this moment, and James could see Morrison calculating, weighing options, deciding whether to go down fighting or surrender to face trial and imprisonment and the slow death of life in a cage. Dillon appeared in the doorway behind Morrison, rifle trained on the old CIA officer, giving him no avenue of escape. Hayes was there too, and more SEALs, surrounding the building, sealing every exit. Morrison was trapped, caught between James's mercy and Dillon's justice, and the choice he made now would define how his story ended. "You should have died in those mountains," Morrison said quietly. "Volkov should have killed you, would have saved me from having to look at you, from seeing Marcus's faith in you reflected in your face. Maybe, but I didn't die. And now you have to decide if you're going to kill an unarmed man in front of witnesses and go down as a murderer, or if you're going to put down the rifle and face trial with whatever dignity you have left." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, and for a heartbeat James thought this was it. Thought the old CIA officer would choose death over capture, would take them both out in a final gesture of defiance. But then something shifted in Morrison's eyes. Some recognition that revenge wouldn't bring Marcus back. That killing James would just create another father's grief without ending his own. He lowered the rifle slowly, let it hang from its sling, raised his hands in surrender. "I'm done," Morrison said, voice empty. "Take me in." The SEALs moved forward, secured him, led him away in flex cuffs while he walked without resistance, all the fight gone out of him. James watched him go and felt nothing but exhaustion, the kind that went bone deep and spirit deep and couldn't be fixed with sleep or rest or anything except time and distance. Dillon came to stand beside him. "You could have shot him, would have been justified. I've shot enough people. One more wouldn't have changed anything." James looked at Bobby Cross's son, saw the young SEAL trying to understand why mercy had been shown to a man who'd orchestrated so much death. "Your father taught me that sometimes the hardest thing is choosing not to kill. Sometimes that takes more courage than pulling the trigger." He really said that? Not in those exact words, but he lived it. Saved my life when he could have let me die, could have taken the easy path. I've spent 23 years trying to live up to that example. Today felt like maybe I finally managed it. They walked out of the building together into sunlight that felt too bright, too clean for what had just happened. The base was returning to normal operations, soldiers going about their duties. The crisis contained and controlled the way the military specialized in containing and controlling things. Hayes met them at the operations center, face showing relief and exhaustion mixed together. "Morrison's in custody. He's already asking for a lawyer, already trying to cut deals. But we've got enough evidence to put him away for life, even with whatever intelligence he thinks he can trade." "Good," James said. "Make sure the families of the soldiers he got killed know he's been caught. They deserve that much." Already being handled. And Jim, there's something else. Morrison had files, backups of everything he'd done over the years, including stuff about you, about operations you were involved in that were supposed to stay buried. Hayes handed over a thumb drive. "Reeves says you should decide what gets released and what stays classified. It's your life, your story. You get to choose how it's told." James took the drive, felt the weight of it, all those secrets compressed into a piece of plastic and silicone. He could destroy it, erase the evidence of things he'd done that no one should ever know about. Or he could let it exist, let history judge him for the choices he'd made. Neither option felt right, but that was the nature of impossible choices. You picked the one you could live with and hoped it didn't destroy you. Jake Morrison recovered consciousness 2 days later in the secure medical facility, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that monitored his recovery with electronic precision. James sat beside the bed, having asked for this moment, needing to see the kid one more time before he left Afghanistan for good. The young sniper's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition, and then a smile that was pure relief. "You're alive," Morrison said, voice raspy from the ventilator tube they'd only recently removed. "They said you might not make it. They say that about me a lot. I'm starting to think they're overestimating my mortality." James leaned forward, clasped Morrison's hand. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got shot, but alive. Thanks to you." Morrison squeezed back weakly. "They told me what happened, about the assassination attempt, about you stopping it, about everything you did to keep me breathing. That's what old men do. We keep young men alive so they can make different choices than we did. I want to make those choices. Want to be better than I was. Want to..." Morrison trailed off, suddenly fighting tears. "I almost died, Shepard. I saw it coming, felt that bullet hit me, and all I could think was how much time I'd wasted being arrogant. Being stupid. I don't want to waste any more. Then don't. You've been given a second chance. Use it. Teach others what you learn. Be the kind of warrior Bobby Cross was, the kind who saves lives instead of just taking them. Morrison nodded, not trusting his voice, and they sat in silence for a while. Two men from different generations connected by blood and bullets and the choice to keep fighting for something better than revenge. James left him sleeping and walked out into Afghan sunlight for the last time. His discharge papers signed, his gear packed, his war finally over. Dylan drove him to the airfield where a transport waited to carry him home, neither man speaking because words felt inadequate for the moment. At the plane steps, Dylan pulled out the compass, the one Bobby had given James and James had given him. You should take this back. It brought you home like you said it would. Keep it. Pass it to your kids someday. Tell them it belonged to a man who understood that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. James smiled. Your father taught me that. Now I'm teaching you. Maybe someday you'll teach someone else. That's how the best of us stays alive. Dylan pocketed the compass, saluted formally despite James being a civilian, holding it until James returned the gesture. Then he was gone, walking back to his team, back to his war, back to the cycle that James was finally breaking free of. The flight home was long and uncomfortable, 20 hours of cramped seats and recycled air. But James didn't mind. Every mile was a mile closer to Mary, closer to Montana, closer to the life he'd put on hold for 40 years. He slept fitfully, dreaming of mountains and gunfire. But for the first time in decades, the dreams didn't feel like nightmares. They felt like memories, things that had happened and were now finished, ghosts that had been acknowledged and could finally rest. Mary was waiting at the airport in Billings, standing by the pickup truck, and when James saw her, his vision blurred with tears he didn't try to hide. She met him halfway across the parking lot and held him while he shook, held him while 23 years of accumulated trauma tried to tear him apart, held him until he could breathe again without feeling like the world was crushing him. I'm home, he managed finally. I know, I've got you. You're home. They drove back to the cabin in the mountains, and James looked out at the familiar landscape, the peaks and valleys he'd spent his retirement years exploring, and they looked different now. Less like places where men fought and died, more like just mountains, beautiful and indifferent and present. The war was over. The ghosts were quiet. He could finally rest. 6 months later, James stood in the classroom at Fort Benning, looking at 30 new students who'd come to learn how to be snipers, how to kill with precision and live with the consequences. But this time, his teaching was different. This time, he spent as much time talking about the weight of taking a life as he did about the mechanics of taking a shot. The rifle is a tool, he told them, holding up his old M40 with its 99 marks. It doesn't make you powerful. It doesn't make you special. It just makes you responsible. Every time you pull this trigger, you are making a choice that will echo for the rest of your life. Make sure it's a choice you can live with. Morrison was there, recovered enough to return to limited duty, helping with demonstrations, sharing his own story about almost dying and choosing to live differently. Dylan visited twice, bringing his family, letting his kids meet the man who'd saved their grandfather's life decades before they were born. And at night, James went home to Mary, to the cabin where he'd hung up his rifle and his ghosts, where he slept without nightmares and woke without the weight of impending violence. The phone sometimes rang with calls from young soldiers who needed advice, from veterans struggling with memories, from men who'd heard the legend of the shepherd and needed to know that survival was possible. He answered every call, gave what wisdom he could, told them all the same thing. The war ends when you decide it ends. Not when the shooting stops, but when you choose to stop carrying it. I made that choice. You can too. On Thanksgiving, Dylan brought his family to Montana, and they sat around the table while James told stories about Bobby Cross, about the Marines who'd fought in deserts and mountains, about sacrifice and brotherhood, and the debt that could only be repaid by living well and teaching others to do the same. Dylan's son, named Robert after his grandfather, sat transfixed, listening to tales of heroes and monsters and the thin line between them. When dinner was over, James took the boy outside to watch the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. Your grandfather saved my life, James said, letting the boy hold the compass that had made the journey from Kuwait to Afghanistan to Montana. And because he did, I got to save your father's life. And maybe someday, your father will save someone else's. That's how we honor the dead. Not by avenging them, but by continuing what they started. Building instead of destroying, protecting instead of killing. Young Robert nodded solemnly, not fully understanding but feeling the weight of it, the importance of legacy and choice, and the continuous chain of warriors passing wisdom down through generations. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with beauty. James stood with his hand on the boy's shoulder, Mary's hand in his, Dylan and Hayes and Morrison all present, all alive, all choosing to break the cycle of violence and build something better from the wreckage. The ghosts were quiet now, not gone, never gone, but at peace. Viktor Volkov and Alexei Volkov, Bobby Cross and Marcus Morrison, all the men who died in distant valleys fighting wars that never truly ended, they could rest now because the living had chosen to stop adding new names to the list of the dead. James Mackenzie, the shepherd, the legend, the last of his kind, had finally come home. And in coming home, he'd shown that survival wasn't just about lasting until the shooting stopped. It was about choosing to live after, choosing to love after, choosing to teach the next generation that honor wasn't found in vengeance, but in the daily choice to be better than your worst moments. The mountains stood eternal, indifferent, waiting for the next war, the next cycle. But tonight, in this moment, they watched over a man who'd fought long enough, a family gathered in peace, and a future where maybe, just maybe, the stories passed down would be about wisdom instead of warfare, about healing instead of hurt. The last shepherd had brought his flock home, and in doing so had taught them all that the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies. It was becoming someone who didn't need enemies anymore, someone who could lay down the rifle and pick up the compass, who could trade killing for teaching, who could choose life over death every single day until the choice became natural instead of painful. The war was over. The man remained, and that was enough.